I'll tell you something I learned far too late in my life on the road. Most scary RV stories don't start with a scream. They start with a quiet detail you ignore, a sound that doesn't match the night, a shadow shaped wrong, a person who smiles a second too long. And once you pass that first detail, once you brush it off as imagination or wind or nerves, you're already inside the story you thought only happened to other people. My name's Mark Henley, 46 years old, born and raised in Kansas, but molded by the road. I've been RV camping for more than half my life. And like most people who've traveled long enough, I used to shrug off those strange tales you see online, the ones about whispers in national forests, about campers who vanish without gear, about lights that move like they're choosing who to follow. I thought they were myths crafted to entertain, or maybe warnings stretched into folklore. That changed the night I tried to prove those stories wrong. Late last fall, I decided to camp alone for a week along a route known for viral RV horror stories. My goal was simple: expose them. Shine a little truth on the dark corners of camping legend. I traveled in my old Volkswagen camper van, a blue 91 Westphalia with a temperamental sliding door and a heater that only worked when bribed with curses. I loved that van more than some people love their houses, but that week it became something else, a mirror that showed me exactly who I was when fear stripped everything down to instinct. The first night, I parked at a small campground in northern Arizona, tucked against the edge of a ponderosa forest. Nothing special, just 8 gravel sites, a pit toilet, and a hand-painted sign so faded you could barely read the campground's name. I picked it because of a story I'd heard online. A couple claimed to hear footsteps circling their RV all night, but when they checked the morning dust, no prints were there, not even their own. I wasn't scared when I pulled in. If anything, I felt smug. I even recorded a video for the channel joking about how I was finally going to debunk the great ghost of campsite number 4. I laughed. I actually laughed. But fear doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. It started with something small, the quiet. Not normal outdoor quiet, not the peaceful hush of pine needles and wind. This was suspended, like the air was holding its breath. I couldn't hear insects, couldn't hear branches shifting or the distant hum of the highway. It was silence with intention, silence that waited. I remember sitting by the fire, poking at the wood with a stick, and feeling like I was being watched from just beyond where the flames reached. That sensation, the one where your skin knows something before your mind does, it crept over me like cold water, but I forced myself to ignore it. I was here to prove the stories were myths, right? When the fire burned low, I climbed into the van, shut the door, and told myself the quiet was nothing. But then came the footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. They didn't crunch gravel, they pressed into it. A sound too controlled to belong to an animal, too measured to be wind. It circled the van once, twice, 3 times. Every time it reached the sliding door, it paused, just long enough for me to feel the weight of whatever stood there. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink. I kept telling myself it was a deer or an elk or someone who'd arrived late and was looking for a sight. Anything but the thing it felt like, something testing the boundaries of my fear. After the 3rd circle, the footsteps stopped. I didn't hear them walk away. They just vanished. When I finally fell asleep, it wasn't because I felt safe. It was because fear exhausts you in a way nothing else can. Morning brought sunlight, and sunlight tricks you into believing you imagined the night before. I stepped out of the van expecting to see some kind of prints, tracks, scratches, disturbed gravel, anything. But just like the old story, the ground was clean, undisturbed, untouched. I convinced myself it was coincidence. Maybe the gravel was just packed hard. Maybe I'd been too tired and misheard the woods. Denial is a powerful thing. It makes you choose logic even when logic doesn't choose you. By the 4th day of that trip, I'd visited 3 different campgrounds, each with their own myths. A man who wandered into a canyon and returned without his voice. A family who heard tapping on their RV roof every dawn for a week straight. A solo camper who claimed her headlights turned on by themselves at 3 a.m., pointing into the forest as if something wanted her to see inside. Most people think these stories come from fear, but I learned something important. They come from patterns we don't want to see. All week, the same things kept happening to me. Not dramatic, Hollywood stuff, subtle changes, quiet shifts, little distortions. At one campsite in Utah, my van door, the one that never stayed closed, suddenly sealed so tight I had to shove my shoulder into it to open it again. At another site, every time I stepped out at night, it smelled like wet soil, even though the ground was bone dry. And at one stop near the Colorado border, I heard someone whistle the first 4 notes of a tune I hadn't heard since childhood, my father's tune, even though I was alone for miles. That night was when the story finally stopped being myth and started being mine. I had parked beside an empty lake with no houses, no boats, no other campers. I wanted to end my trip with a final myth. The story of a phantom camper who supposedly waved at people across the lake at dusk, even when there was no one on the other shore. I was tired, hungry, and ready to go home. But as the sun dipped behind the ridge, something strange happened. The air got cold, not like evening cold, but like someone opened a freezer around me. My breath fogged, my hands stung. I turned toward the water, and someone was standing across the lake. Too far to see clearly, too still to be human, but tall and facing me. I froze. The sky dimmed. The lake reflected nothing, as if the figure absorbed the light instead of blocking it. At first, I didn't believe what I was seeing. My brain scrambled for excuses. A burned tree trunk, a trick of the shadows, a reflection, anything that wasn't a person. But then it lifted its arm and waved, slowly, deliberately. The same wave described in the old story, the wave of someone who knows exactly who you are. I didn't wave back. I couldn't. Something inside me, some old instinct older than logic, said that acknowledging it was the one thing I should never do. But the figure didn't drop its arm. Instead, it stepped closer to the shoreline, not toward the water, toward me. And that was when the panic finally broke through the denial. That was when my fear stopped whispering and started screaming. I grabbed my keys, stumbled into the van, fired up the engine, and didn't even bother shutting the sliding door before I sped off. Gravel shot out behind me. My headlights shook with every bump. My heart hammered so hard it felt like another engine inside my chest. But as I drove away, something else happened. Something worse. My radio, the radio that hadn't worked in years, turned itself on. And out of the static, through the cracking distortion, a voice whispered my name. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until the van lurched onto the main road and the static shattered into silence. The voice, my name, drawn out like someone trying to remember how human speech worked, cut off mid-syllable. The air inside the van felt thinner somehow, like whatever had spoken was still lingering in the upholstery, deciding whether to stay or follow. I kept driving, didn't look in the mirrors, didn't look at the dark tree line rushing past. I just stared straight ahead, gripping the wheel until my knuckles drained white, whispering to myself that I was done. I was done with the myths, done with the stories, done with the challenge I had built this whole trip around. But fear makes you slow to admit you're defeated, and I didn't want to face the truth yet, the truth that something out there was aware of me. When I finally stopped, it was only because my hands were shaking too hard to keep the van between the lines. I pulled into a rest area, empty, abandoned looking, a single flickering lamp by the bathrooms, and killed the engine. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was judgment, like the night was asking why I'd run. But sitting there, catching my breath, I made a mistake that still feels like the moment where everything shifted from strange to personal. I said out loud, I don't believe it. It wasn't real. Not to reassure myself, not to calm down, almost like I was challenging something. Immediately, the van creaked. Not its normal settling sound, the one every old Volkswagen makes when it cools. This was sharper, heavier, like something brushed the outside paneling with open hands. I froze. The hair on my arms rose as if grabbed by invisible fingers. Then came the sound I will never forget. A low, slow exhale, not wind, dragging along the passenger side window. I could feel it through the glass. Hot. Too close. Too deliberate. That was when I understood that the stories I'd spent years mocking weren't cautionary. They were invitations. Not warnings about danger, but lures to bring people like me deeper into places where logic dissolves. I didn't sleep that night, didn't rest. When dawn finally broke, I started the engine without looking at the passenger side of the van. I kept my eyes on the road, the kind of tunnel vision you get when you're afraid that acknowledging anything outside your own breath will give it permission to exist. I drove until the desert opened around me, long stretches of tan and gold, sagebrush scattered like forgotten thoughts. That openness was the first moment I felt I could breathe again. No trees to hide behind, no reflections, no shadows, or so I thought. Deserts hold their own quiet, not the suffocating kind from that first campground. This was different. This quiet felt rehearsed, manufactured, as if everything that normally lived out there had stepped aside to let something else pass through. Around noon, after hours of driving, exhaustion started pressing down on me like a heavy hand on my spine. I pulled into a primitive camping area near an old dry wash. No other vehicles, no shade, no sound except the ticking of the cooling engine. I told myself I needed just a moment, just a few minutes to rest my eyes before I continued home. I crawled into the back of the van, left the slider cracked for airflow, and sat with my back against the cabinetry. My heartbeat was finally slowing, dropping out of panic and into something closer to drained numbness. That's when the smell drifted in. Wet soil. The exact scent I'd encountered 2 nights earlier, the one that made no sense in a dry forest. Now it made even less sense in the desert heat. It hit me so fast and so strong it felt like someone had scooped up a handful of mud and pressed it under my nose. I stood instantly and slid the door shut, locking it even though I knew that tiny latch wasn't going to stop anything determined. My pulse spiked. My throat tightened. The dread from the night before came roaring back in a tidal wave, but I kept telling myself it had to be something normal, a damp patch of earth, a gust of air carrying scent from somewhere distant, something explainable, anything explainable. That denial, stubborn, clinging denial, is the only reason I caught the next detail as slowly as I did. The van wasn't level anymore. I felt it under my feet, a tilt, a subtle lean to the right, as though something heavy had settled its weight on the outside of the van. I pressed my palm to the window. Nothing. Then, from outside the metal panel beneath my hand, a single tap, not a branch, not a pebble, a knuckle. I jerked back so fast I hit my elbow on the cupboard edge. Pain flared up my arm. But even through the pain, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. 3 times. Slow. Like someone trying to decide if they remembered the rhythm correctly. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the wall of the van like my eyes could somehow see through it. My mouth was dry, my breathing shallow. Every instinct in my body screamed to run. But run where? Into a desert with no cover? Away from a van that was at least a barrier between me and whatever tapped? I did the only thing I could think of. I turned on the ignition. The van sputtered. Once, twice, the lazy choke of an engine too old and too hot to obey. I slapped the steering wheel. "Come on," I whispered. Come on, please." On the 3rd try, the engine caught. The tap on the side of the van stopped immediately. That silence, that sudden, total silence was worse than the knocking. It felt like decision, like something outside had shifted from curiosity to certainty. I threw the van into gear and floored it, tires spitting dust behind me. As I pulled onto the wash road, I risked a glance into the mirror. Nothing, just the shimmering heat and the pale dirt. But then, the smell followed. Wet soil, strong and suffocating, filling the van even as the desert wind whipped through the cracked windows. It was inside with me, not carried, not drifting. It was there like it had been waiting in the back seat, breathing shallowly behind my ear. And then my radio, dead since the night before, crackled again. This time it didn't whisper my name. It repeated the 3 taps. Tap, 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 tap. And then, after a long stretch of static where something almost sounded like breath. Why did you run? The voice wasn't human, too stretched, too flat, as if someone had heard words once and didn't understand the mechanics of emotion behind them. I almost drove off the road. Fear took control of my limbs. Not logic, not instinct, just raw animal panic, the kind you think only exists in survival documentaries. The desert blurred on either side of me as I pushed the van faster than it had any right to go. I didn't stop until I reached a town, a small gas station with sun-faded paint, an old Coke machine, and 2 pumps older than I was. Civilization had never looked so beautiful. I parked, jumped out, and slammed the van door closed like that act alone would erase everything that had chased me. I paced the gravel. I drank water. I tried convincing myself I was safe again. But safety isn't a place. It's a feeling. And that feeling never came. Not when I stood in the sunlight, not when I filled the tank, not even when an older woman stepped out of the gas station and asked if I was all right because I looked like someone who brought the desert back with him. That wording, brought the desert back, sank into my stomach like a stone. I didn't know what she meant. I didn't want to know. And then, as I went to climb back into the van, I smelled it again, wet soil, coming from inside, not faint, not drifting, but strong, as if something had never left the van at all, as if it had been waiting for me to open the door. I froze with my hand on the sliding door handle, the smell of wet soil rising like a warning from the dark interior. It was stronger now, thicker, as though the air itself had weight. Behind me, the desert sun beat down, but the scent drifting from the van felt cold, like the breath of a deep underground cavern. I told myself I wasn't going to open that door. No amount of gear, no sense of pride, no desire to debunk a myth was worth stepping into whatever waited inside. But fear has a strange way of stripping you down to instinct and memory. And my instinct, owned from decades of RV travel, said that if I left the van here, fled from it, I'd never outrun the thing that had followed me. Running wasn't escape. It was invitation. So I took a breath, slid the door open, and braced myself. Nothing jumped out. Nothing moved. The interior of the van was exactly as I'd left it. Stove closed, bedding rumpled, cooler lid, still slightly cracked, but every shadow looked too dense. Every corner seemed deeper. And beneath it all was that smell, pooling low like fog. I climbed in slowly, checking behind the driver's seat, under the table, beneath the bench. Every space was empty. But the scent was stronger near the back, near the small cabinet where I kept tools and emergency supplies. I hesitated, then crouched and opened it. My tools were gone. All of them. The flashlight, the mallet, the old pocket knife I kept for cutting rope, every metal piece, every useful edge, gone as if they'd been lifted away by careful hands. But in the empty space where they should have been, 3 small marks pressed into the wood. Not scratches, not dents. Tap, tap. My entire spine tightened. Those marks hadn't been there 2 days ago. They couldn't have been. I cleaned that cabinet monthly. I knew every scuff and scrape. But these were new, fresh, as if someone had tapped there recently and with enough force to leave a permanent reminder. I didn't stay to analyze them. I slammed the cabinet shut, slid into the driver's seat, and cranked the engine. And for the first time in days, the van responded instantly, as if it too wanted to get away. I drove without thinking, barely aware of the road as I gunned it back toward the highway. My breath shook, my thoughts scattered. But one thing stood out above everything else. One truth that hit me with sudden clarity. This wasn't about proving myths wrong anymore. This was about surviving whatever I'd stumbled into. I got a motel room that night. Not a campsite, not a pull-off, but a real room with real walls, a lock, and fluorescent lights humming overhead. The kind of place I used to avoid. But that night, the peeling wallpaper and rattling air conditioner felt safer than any forest or desert ever could. For hours, I sat on the end of the bed, staring at the door as if expecting it to breathe. Every sound of the building, footsteps upstairs, the hum of plumbing, the faint muttering of a TV in another room, made my nerves snap tighter. Around midnight, exhaustion finally dragged me under. But sleep didn't save me. It delivered me. I dreamt I was back in the van, sitting in the driver's seat while the desert hissed outside. Only this time, I couldn't move. Couldn't lift my hands. Couldn't speak. My body felt pinned, held by something cold pressing against my shoulders. Outside the windshield, darkness stirred. Not shadows. Not wind. Something walking. Slow, dragging footsteps approached, the kind that didn't lift fully off the ground. And with each step, the smell filled the van. Damp earth, rich and heavy, like soil turned after rain. Then fingers, too long, too many, curled over the top of the windshield, gripping the metal as if pulling itself up to look inside. I woke gasping, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. The motel room was silent, but the smell wasn't gone. It seeped under the door, faint, drifting, but unmistakable. Wet soil, again. Here, inside a building surrounded by pavement. I stumbled to the window and looked outside. My van sat alone under the buzzing street lamp, and someone, or something, was standing beside it. A tall shape, motionless, facing the motel. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. I dropped to the floor, crawling backward until my shoulders hit the bed frame. My hands shook uncontrollably. My vision blurred at the edges. But when I forced myself to look again, pressing my face to the lowest gap in the blinds, the figure was gone. The van was still there, still alone. But the space beside it was empty, as if the desert heat had erased the shape entirely. I didn't sleep again, and I didn't go outside until morning sunlight poured into the room, flooding it with warmth that didn't feel entirely earned. When I walked out to the van, I circled it slowly. No footprints, no dents, but when I reached the passenger side, my stomach dropped. Along the metal drawn through the thin layer of dust were 3 straight lines. Not scratches, not smears. Drawn like someone dragging 3 fingers while watching me sleep. Tap, tap, tap. Transformed into a message. I scrapped the remainder of the trip. I didn't record anything, didn't narrate, didn't reflect. My only goal was to get home, park the van in my driveway, lock my front door, and try to convince myself that whatever followed me belonged to the wilderness, not to me. For 2 days, nothing happened. No smell, no radio, no tapping, no sightings. For the first time since the lake, the fear started to loosen its grip. I told myself maybe it had ended. Maybe whatever it was lived in the desert and it couldn't cross into towns and neighborhoods. But the truth waited for me on the 3rd night. I woke to tapping. Not on the windows, not on the walls. From inside the house. 3 taps, rhythmic, measured. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up in bed, heart slamming, breath gone, every nerve alight. The room was dark, the kind of darkness that feels thick enough to taste. I forced myself to listen. Another tap, deeper this time, coming from the hallway. Then a second sound layered underneath. A dragging footstep, slow and heavy, moving toward my bedroom door. I whispered to myself, this isn't real, even though every part of me knew it was the only real thing in the room. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Silence stretched tight, stretched thin, so thin it almost hummed. Then, my radio turned on. Not the van radio. My bedside clock radio. A device I hadn't used in years. Static filled the room. And through that static, the voice returned. Clearer now, closer now, shaped like something learning to imitate speech. Why did you run? The bedroom door handle clicked, turned, slowly, like someone testing how loud they needed to be to wake me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My muscles locked, trapped between terror and disbelief. The door creaked open an inch, just enough for darkness to spill through, just enough for the smell to drift in. Wet soil, the same smell from the forest, the same smell from the desert, the same smell from the van. It had followed me home. It had chosen me. And it wanted an answer. I don't remember deciding to move. It was like survival took over before consciousness caught up. One moment I was frozen, staring at that door cracked open just a few inches. The next, I was rolling out of bed, hitting the floor hard enough to knock the breath out of me. I crawled backward until my shoulders pressed against the far wall, as if distance alone could save me. The static from the radio deepened, shifting in tone, almost curious, like it was listening for something inside the room. I wanted to speak, to scream, to do anything, but my voice wouldn't rise. My throat sealed tight with fear. Then the door opened the rest of the way, not fast, not violently, but with slow, deliberate intention. The hallway beyond was pitch black, darker than any hallway in a normal home should be. But within that darkness, a shape leaned forward, tall, thin, its edges blurred like it wasn't fully in this world. And even before I saw any detail at all, I knew it had the same wrong presence that had waved at me across that lake, the same presence that circled my van, the same presence that left tapping marks like fingerprints behind my tools. It wasn't random. It had been following me step by step. The smell flooded the room, thick enough to taste, damp soil, old and heavy. It pushed memories into my mind like someone whispering inside my thoughts. The forest, the lake, the desert wash, the motel parking lot. Every place I went, it had been close. Closer than I realized. The figure shifted, not fully stepping into the room, but leaning just far enough that I could feel something move the air. A pressure, a weight. Then it spoke again. Why did you run? The voice came from everywhere, from the radio, from the walls, maybe even from inside my own head. It had the tone of something trying to understand a question, not ask one, like it didn't comprehend fear, or maybe it wanted to. I forced out a whisper, barely audible. I didn't know what you were. The static paused. The figure stilled. A moment of absolute silence stretched between us. Then a low, dragging footstep entered the room. I scrambled sideways, nearly knocking over the lamp. I grabbed it, pulled the cord from the wall, and held it like a weapon, even though I knew it would do nothing. But fear makes you cling to anything that fits in your hand. The thing stepped closer. I felt it, the chill spreading across the carpet, an invisible cold front rolling toward me. My eyes watered. My muscles shook. Not because I thought I was going to die, because I thought it wanted something worse. It stopped just a few feet away. I still couldn't make out its features, the swarkness swallowed too much, but I saw the faint outline of its limbs. Too long, too thin, as if someone built from the idea of a human, not the reality. And then it did something that nearly broke me. It reached out a hand, not fast, not threatening, just reaching, like it wanted me to take it. The fear inside me twisted. Not everything we fear wants to hurt us. Some things just want to pull us somewhere we don't understand, somewhere we might not come back from. That was the dread I felt, not teeth or claws or violence, but an invitation, a pull toward a place I had no map for. My chest tightened, my heart hammered. I shook my head, barely managing the motion. No. The figure tilted its head, jerking slightly, as if it didn't know how to interpret the answer. The fingers curled and uncurled once, testing the space between us, and then it tapped the floor. Tap, tap, tap. The exact rhythm it used on my van. The exact rhythm it scratched into the dust. A pattern, a signal. Something ancient in the way it communicated, simple, direct, primal. I whispered again, louder this time through clenched teeth. I said no. And something inside the room shifted, not physically, but in the air, as though the atmosphere tightened. The figure straightened. The static on the radio rose in pitch, almost metallic, like frustration, like disappointment. It stepped backward, one slow movement, then another. With each step, the smell faded. With each step, the air warmed. With each step, the room grew lighter. When it reached the doorway, it stopped one last time. Its head turned toward me, a motion that felt too smooth, too fluid. The radio hissed, "Not finished." The words crawled through the room like a shadow dragging itself across the floor, and then the door slammed shut. The force blew dust from the baseboards, the lamp shook in my hands, the static cut out instantly, the radio dead, lifeless, silent. I sat there for a long time, shaking, unable to move, staring at the door as if expecting it to breathe again. It never did. Not that night. And for a while, I believed that was the end. But endings in stories like these don't come clean. They don't come fast. They settle into your life the way fog settles onto the highway, slowly, invisibly, until you can't tell where the air ends and the danger begins. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened. No tapping, no smell, no radio, No figures standing by the van. I started telling myself it had left, that whatever it was had retreated back into the desert or the lake or the dark part of the forest where it belonged. That maybe my refusal was enough. But fear has memory, and the road has rules we don't understand. The first sign came when I tried to clean the van, to finally scrub out the smell and the dirt and the trip itself. I opened the cabinet where my tools had been, half expecting the marks to be gone. Instead, there were more. 3 sets of 3 marks, like fingers tapping, each deeper than the last. Something had been there recently. The second sign came 3 days later when I left the house for groceries. My neighbor across the street, retired, observant, the type who notices everything, waved me down and said, "Someone was standing next to your van last night. Tall fella, didn't see him leave." I asked what time. 3 a.m, he said. Didn't look like he belonged here. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after, or the one after that. And then the third sign came without warning. The one that told me the story was never about one campground, one lake, one desert wash, one van, or one night. It happened when I turned on the camera to record a new video for the channel. Something ordinary, something unrelated to all of this. A gear review, a simple, safe piece of content. I hit record, and before I said a single word, the microphone picked up something behind me. Soft, barely audible, but real. Tap, tap, tap. I turned slowly, heart climbing into my throat. Nothing was there, but the smell, faint, drifting, undeniable, filled the room, wet soil. And that was when I understood the truth about all those I once tried to expose. They aren't myths. They aren't legends. They aren't warnings. They're invitations. Doors left open, threads waiting to be pulled. And once you pull one, it pulls back. Some things follow you because they're curious. Some follow you because they're hungry. But the worst kind, the kind I brought home, follow you because you looked at them, because you noticed, because you ran, and they're not finished with you. Not by a long shot. I've learned that the quietest moments in the mountains are the ones you should fear the most. The silences that feel too deep, too perfect, too untouched, like someone or something pressed a hand against the world and held its breath. I didn't understand that lesson until last fall, when I found myself parked off a narrow Forest Service road in my old blue Volkswagen Westfalia, staring into the Appalachian darkness that locals said swallowed people whole. I wasn't a through hiker. I wasn't chasing any 6-month pilgrimage across the ridges. I was just looking for a few days alone after a long season of feeling like I was drifting. Work uncertainty, the end of a relationship that lasted longer than it should have, and a growing sense that I'd been ignoring my instincts for years. I used to love camping in my Volkswagen. It had always felt like a small, mobile sanctuary. But for the first time in my life, it felt like I was bringing a fragile version of myself into a place that could easily break it. The place I chose wasn't even a proper campground, just a small pull-off near a trail spur that merged with the Appalachian Trail several miles ahead. Locals at a nearby gas station told me hikers occasionally used it for parking before stepping deeper into the woods. The woman behind the counter, a silver-haired Appalachian local named Marlene, warned me the trail was confusing at night and that people sometimes got turned around even during the day. She said it calmly, like it was a gentle fact instead of a caution, but the younger guy stocking shelves froze when he heard her. "You ain't talking about the ridgeline, are you?" he asked her, darting a glance at me. She shot him a stare sharp enough to cut bark off a tree. "Stock the chips," she told him. He didn't speak again. It was the kind of exchange that should have made me reconsider camping anywhere near the ridgeline. But stubbornness is a strange anchor. I told myself they were just superstitious. Every region has its folklore. Lost hikers, strange lights, unsettling stories meant to keep kids close to home. I'd grown up with the same things. Still, as I drove up the gravel road and found the turnout, I couldn't shake the look on that young man's face. I stepped outside after parking and took in the forest. The air felt cool, a light breeze brushing against the sleeves of my flannel shirt. The sun was low, filtering through the trees in streaks of gold that looked almost painted on. The scene felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind of peace that hides something wrong underneath. I walked around, checking the site, trying to ground myself. I took slow breaths, the smell of damp leaves and old pine needles filling my lungs. My Volkswagen sat quietly behind me, its chipped paint glowing faintly in the dimming light, like an old friend waiting patiently for me to settle my nerves. That's when I first noticed the feeling of being watched, not by a person, not by an animal, but by the woods themselves. It wasn't a sudden jolt of fear. It was a slow, creeping awareness that the forest felt oddly attentive, as though my arrival pierced a stillness that hadn't been broken in a long time. I told myself I was tired, that solitude often amplifies imagination, that the app trail attracted weird stories like the ocean attracted shipwrecks. I'd read enough online forums to know that. The first strange moment came just after dusk. I had set up inside the van, unpacked my sleeping bag, cracked the back windows for ventilation, and made a small dinner on my camp stove. While washing my pot with water from my jug, I heard footsteps on the trail, a steady rhythm, not hurried, not heavy. They sounded close, too close, like the person was just beyond the gloom where my lantern light faded. I stood up straight, pot still in my hands. "Hello?" I called. The footsteps stopped. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer, or maybe someone was night hiking. People do that, although not usually if they're near a trailhead with only one parked vehicle. I listened. Nothing. No crunch of leaves, no exhale of breath, just silence thick enough that my ears strained for any thread of sound. I set the pot down quietly and took a few steps toward the tree line. "Is someone there?" I tried again, raising my voice. Still nothing, but the silence felt heavy now, like the forest was holding itself still on purpose. A shiver slid down my spine. I felt the instinct to retreat into the safety of the Volkswagen, to close the doors, to lock them, to pretend I was imagining things. But my pride kept me rooted in place. I didn't want to be the kind of person who let the woods spook them. I waited another minute. Nothing moved. Eventually, I climbed back into the van and slid the door shut. I locked it without meaning to. It was pure instinct. My breath fogged the window slightly, and for a moment, the outside felt like a dark, endless ocean pressing against the glass. Night thickened quickly after that. The forest turned into a wall of black shapes, the kind that makes you forget what the world looks like in daylight. I laid down, trying to settle in, but my thoughts wouldn't slow. Every scent, every shift of air, every crack of something in the woods kept pulling me back to alertness. Around 11 p.m., when the forest was at its deepest quiet, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not along the trail this time, but circling the van. Slow, deliberate, measured. My pulse hammered. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening to the faint crunch of leaves move toward the back of the van. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a bear. But bears don't walk like people. And this sounded unmistakably human. The steps paused, right near the rear window. I didn't dare sit up. I didn't dare move. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding loud enough I wondered if whoever or whatever was out there could hear it. A soft scrape followed, like fingers dragging lightly across metal. My skin prickled so hard it hurt. I gripped the edge of my sleeping bag, frozen. Another scrape. A little longer this time. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was a branch swaying in the breeze. Maybe an animal had brushed against the van, but the night air was still, dead still, and the sound was too precise, too intentional. Then came the whisper, barely audible, almost swallowed by the darkness. Help. A single word, stretched thin with strain. My blood turned to ice. I bolted upright, adrenaline overpowering the fear that had my body locked a moment before. I leaned toward the back window, trying to see through the darkness, but my lantern wasn't on. The glass was a sheet of black. The whisper came again, closer. Help. This time, it sounded like it was right against the metal. I grabbed my flashlight with shaking hands and aimed it toward the rear window. My breath trembled, my thumb hovering over the switch. Before I could turn it on, the voice changed. It didn't repeat the word. It laughed. Low. Broken. Wrong. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered against the floor as the laughter faded into the trees, swallowed by the night as suddenly as it had begun. I stayed awake until sunrise, and when the sun finally rose, revealing the forest in soft shades of morning gold, I stepped out of the Volkswagen with trembling legs, expecting to see footprints, drag marks, anything. There was nothing, except for one thing. On the back left corner of the van, near the window where the whisper had pressed itself into the night, were 3 long streaks etched into the dust, perfectly parallel, like someone had run their fingers across it. But the streaks weren't from fingers. They were too long, too sharp, and they trailed off toward the trees. I crouched near those long streaks on the back of my van, running my fingertips just above them without touching the metal. The morning light made the marks stand out sharply, 3 unnaturally straight lines like something had been dragged with precise intention. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon digging in the dirt, maybe a bear sniffing around. But the spacing, the length, the clean parallel edges, they didn't match anything I'd seen before. They were too deliberate, too human in their arrangement, too inhuman in their execution. I tried to steady my breathing, pulling the crisp morning air deep into my chest. The scent of wet leaves and distant pine helped ground me for a moment, but the memory of that whisper from the night before tightened inside my ribs like a knot. I packed quickly, tossing gear into the van without caring about my usual organization. Part of me wanted to drive straight down that gravel road, hit the asphalt, and forget this place ever existed. But another part, the part that had pushed me out here in the first place, refused to run without understanding. I'd spent too much of my life ignoring instincts, quieting my own doubts, telling myself I was overreacting when everything inside me was warning otherwise. So instead of leaving, I grabbed my day pack, filled it with water, a few granola bars, and my small first aid kit. I locked the van behind me, though I had no idea what a simple lock could possibly do against something that whispered in the dark. The forest felt different in daylight. Less threatening, but not forgiving. The trees towered above, their leaves rustling in a breeze that didn't quite reach the ground. The air felt thick and cool, like the mountain was holding something close to its chest. I followed a narrow path leading from the turnout toward the spur trail. The dirt was still damp from the night, soft under my boots. Birds called overhead, short, sharp chirps, a woodpecker tapping rhythmically in the distance. Normal sounds. Familiar sounds. They should have comforted me, but instead they felt like a thin veil over something waiting beneath. About 20 minutes up the trail, I reached a fork I hadn't expected. The main spur climbed steadily uphill, but a smaller side trail cut sharply to the right, disappearing into a dense thicket of mountain laurel. The plants arched over the path like a tunnel, their glossy leaves catching the morning light. I would have ignored it if not for the footprints. 2 sets. One larger, deeper, as if the person carried weight or was in a hurry. The other smaller, lighter, barely pressing into the soil. They were fresh, no water pooling, no leaves blown over them, and they led down the narrower trail. A chill rippled through me. My mind flashed to the whisper, to the laughter that followed, to those long marks on my van. I should have turned around. I knew that. Any rational person would. But something in me, curiosity, fear, ego, maybe guilt, pushed me forward. Maybe there really was someone out here who needed help. Maybe someone was injured or lost. Appalachian Trail rescues weren't rare. People misjudged distance, weather, difficulty, but the laughter I'd heard didn't belong to someone needing help. Still, I stepped into the laurel tunnel. The further I walked, the quieter the forest became. Birdsong dimmed until it vanished entirely. Even the wind seemed to retreat, the leaves resting unnaturally still overhead. My own footsteps became the loudest sound in the world. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The rhythm echoed strangely, as if the ground swallowed each footfall a second too late. I rounded a bend and froze. The smaller footprints ended abruptly in the middle of the trail. No turn, no struggle, no backward steps, just stopped. like the person had been lifted straight off the ground. The larger set continued. My throat tightened, and instinct begged me to turn around, to get back to the van before whatever made those marks came back for more. But before I could move, I heard something up ahead. Not footsteps, a rhythm. Knock, naz, knock. Slow, solid, almost like knuckles on wood or bone tapping a hollow surface. I scanned the trees, searching for the source. The sound was close, but the woods swallowed direction. I couldn't tell if it came from the left, right, above, ahead. Knock, knock, knock. A third knock joined in, slightly out of sync. Then a fourth. Knock, 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 pause. Knock, knock, knock. My breath quickened, goosebumps spread down my arms. I took a step backward, my boot snapping a twig underfoot. The knocking stopped instantly. Silence washed over the forest like a wave. I didn't move. I needed to leave. I needed to get back to my van, drive away, pretend none of this ever happened. But before I could turn, a voice drifted from deeper in the woods. Not a whisper. A call. Is someone out there? It sounded like a woman. Tired, strained, afraid. My stomach turned cold. The voice came again, closer this time. I need help, please. Every hair on the back of my neck rose. The words were right, but the tone was wrong. Too flat, too even. Like someone trying to mimic a human voice without understanding emotion. I took a step back, another, but the voice followed, rising between the trees like fog. Please, help me, I'm lost. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My legs kept moving, but instinct steering them backward, even as fear threatened to lock my joints. I turned to leave. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the trail I just walked, no more than 15 feet away. A young woman, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair and a pale face smudged with dirt. Her clothes hung unevenly on her body, ripped at the sleeves. Her chest rose and fell quickly, like she'd been running. But her eyes were wrong. Wide. Unblinking. Too still. Help, she said again. But her lips barely moved. The sound didn't match her expression, didn't match her breath, like the voice was coming from somewhere behind her. I stepped back. She stepped forward. My pulse hammered against the inside of my skull. I heard someone, I stammered, unable to control the shake in my voice. Are you hurt? She tilted her head just slightly. The movement jerked, unnatural, like a puppet being pulled from the wrong string. Lost, she whispered, her voice flattening further. I didn't want to take another step backward on the uneven ground, but every cell in my body screamed for distance. She inched toward me again, her movements stiff, like she didn't fully understand how her own legs worked. Then the knocking returned. Loud. Close. All around us. Knock, knock, knock. Knock. Her head snapped toward the sound too fast, like her neck didn't offer resistance. When she turned back to me, something inside her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The blank facade strained, like something behind her face was trying to press forward. And then she smiled. Wide. Too wide. A shape that didn't belong on a human face. I ran. I didn't think about direction. I didn't think about the fork in the trail. I didn't think about the footprints or the whisper or the laughter. I just ran, crashing through the laurel tunnel, branches scraping against my arms and legs. My breath burned my lungs, my heartbeat thundered in my ears, and the knocking grew louder behind me. Knock, 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 knock. I stumbled onto the main spur trail, nearly falling. I sprinted downhill, my boots sliding on loose dirt, my hands grabbing at trunks to steady myself. The forest blurred around me, trees smearing into streaks of green and brown. I didn't look back. I couldn't, but I heard her. Her footsteps, heavy now, fast, chasing me. A sharp cry split the woods behind me, not pain, not fear. Something else, something hungry. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I pushed harder. The trail flattened. The parking turnout came into view. I sprinted the last stretch, practically throwing myself at the van. My hands fumbled the keys, almost dropping them before I tore the door open and dove inside. I slammed the lock. Silence. Just my own ragged breathing. Then, tap on the window beside me. Slow, soft, rhythmic. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap. I turned, breath frozen in my throat. Through the glare on the glass, through the tangle of morning shadows, two eyes stared in, unblinking, wrong. And the smile returned. I froze, staring into those eyes through the fogged glass of the van's window, unable to look away even though every part of me screamed to. They were too close, too deliberate, like whatever stood outside wasn't trying to scare me accidentally. It wanted me to feel it, to drown in the certainty that the thing staring back wasn't human. The smile didn't move, not a twitch, not a tremble. It stayed stretched across that pale face like something painted on, a mask held in place by invisible fingers. The tapping continued. Tap, tap, pause, tap. The last tap felt harder, more confident, as if the thing was learning something about me, testing me, adjusting. I didn't know what to do. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The van that had always been my refuge, my roaming safe space, felt flimsy now. Just a thin shell of metal separating me from something I didn't understand. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for the ignition. The keys rattled. I slipped once, twice before I managed to slide them in. When the engine turned over, the sound was louder than it had ever been in my life. It startled me. It must have startled her too. Her head snapped sharply toward the noise, her smile vanishing as fast as if someone had wiped it off her face. I shoved the van into reverse. Her hand shot out. It slapped against the rear window with a thud that didn't sound like human skin on glass. It was too heavy, too flat. The entire frame shuddered. I threw the van backward, fishtailing in the gravel as her hand slid across the window, leaving a long, smeared streak in the dust. I turned the wheel hard, gravel spraying, and punched the accelerator. The van lurched forward. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, she was still there on the trail, standing perfectly still in the middle of the turnout. Not running, not chasing, just watching as I sped away, and her head slowly tilted, all the way to the side. Too far, far past what any neck should allow. I pressed harder on the gas, tearing down the forest road, branches slapping the sides of the van, the suspension groaning under every pothole and rock. The road twisted sharply, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, and the drop-off on the right disappeared into a steep ravine. I tried to focus, but my mind kept replaying that smile, that tilt, those eyes. Halfway down the mountain, I had to slow. My hands were shaking too violently to keep a steady line. I pulled off onto a small gravel patch overlooking a dense stretch of forest, my breath heaving like I'd run 10 miles straight. I turned the ignition off. Silence fell over everything, except for my pulse. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to steady myself, trying to think, trying to breathe. The forest looked calm from up here, quiet. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in warm shafts, painting the trees in gold and green. If I hadn't lived the last hour, I might have thought the place was beautiful. I had to call someone. Rangers, police, anyone. I reached for my phone, no signal. I lifted it toward the windshield. Nothing. I leaned closer. Nothing. I knew Appalachian dead zones existed, but this felt different. Yesterday, just a few miles down the road, I'd had 2 bars. Now it was like the mountains swallowed the signal whole. A twig snapped behind the van. I jerked upright. The sound was small, maybe even ordinary, but in the silence, it cut like a blade. I turned slowly, afraid of what I'd see through the back window. Nothing moved. The trees stood perfectly still. No wind, no rustling, no footsteps. But then, another snap. Closer. I didn't even look. I turned the key again and the Volkswagen roared back to life. I shifted into drive and rolled out as gravel spat from under the tires. I didn't speed this time. I couldn't risk hitting a rock wrong and getting stuck. I just drove steady, eyes flicking from the road to the mirrors again and again. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every dark patch between trees felt like eyes watching. Every bump in the road jolted through my spine like electricity. By the time the gravel road hit pavement, my shoulders had locked so tight I could barely turn the steering wheel. When I finally reached a gas station, just a few miles from the one where Marlene had warned me, the sight of other people was enough to shake something loose in my chest. I pulled up next to one of the pumps and sat for a moment, palms pressed to the steering wheel, trying to compose myself. My reflection in the windshield looked pale, drained, with a smear of dirt on my cheek I hadn't noticed before. My eyes looked wild. I stepped out, legs unsteady. The gas station door opened, and the young guy from the day before stepped out, a cardboard box in his hands. When he saw me, he froze. "You look like hell," he said quietly. "I need help," I rasped. "There's someone up there. I mean, something, on the trail." His face drained of color. He set the box down slowly. "Did you go near the ridgeline?" he asked. I don't know what it was called," I said, "but there was a woman, or something that looked like one." She was wrong. He swallowed, glancing over his shoulder toward the trees behind the station. "You shouldn't have stayed up there," he murmured. "Why didn't anyone tell me what was really going on?" "We ain't supposed to," he said. "Folk around here don't talk about it unless they have to. Ranger Station don't even put it on warnings. They think if they ignore it long enough, it'll stop taking people." Ice spread up my spine like climbing frost. "How many?" I asked. He didn't answer. "Marlene," he called into the station. She stepped out a moment later, wiping her hands on a towel. The second she saw me, her eyes softened into something I didn't expect. Fear, real fear, and pity. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I felt myself nod. "And you saw it?" "Yes." She looked at the young man, then at me. "Come inside," she said. "Now." I followed her into the station's dim interior. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, giving everything a yellowish tint. She locked the door behind us. I sat at one of the small diner-style tables near the back while she poured a cup of coffee with hands that weren't steady. The young man lingered near the counter, eyes flicking to the windows as if expecting something to emerge from the tree line. Marlene placed the coffee in front of me. "What you saw," she said softly, "wasn't a person. It wasn't a hiker, but it knows how to look like one." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" She hesitated, then said, "They call it the Echo." The name alone made me tense. Something about it felt too fitting. "It mimics," she continued, "voices, footsteps, cries for help. Sometimes it looks like someone who went missing, sometimes like someone you know." I shivered. "It tries to draw people in," and soft she whispered. "And once it gets close enough, once it learns you." She stopped. The young man finished her sentence. "It follows." A cold wave washed through me. "And it doesn't stop," he added. "How do I get rid of it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Marlene's eyes filled with a sadness that made my stomach drop. "You don't," she said. "You leave. You keep moving. You don't look back, and you pray it didn't learn enough of you last night." A faint sound echoed from outside. A soft, deliberate tap on the glass door. The three of us went still. Tap, tap, pause, tap. My blood froze. Marlene breathed out one broken whisper. "Oh no, it followed you." The tapping on the glass door felt impossibly loud in the cramped gas station. Each sound vibrated through the floor, through the metal shelving, through my bones. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what waited on the other side of that narrow pane. But silence filled the room with a pressure so heavy that doing nothing felt just as dangerous. Marlene raised a trembling hand, her eyes fixed on the door like she was staring down a memory she'd tried to bury. The young man beside her, Ethan, she'd called him earlier, took slow steps toward the back of the store where a rack of tools hung. He grabbed a long-handled tire iron and held it as if it were a lifeline. His knuckles blanched. Tap, tap. A longer pause this time. Tap. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my chest tight. The glass door shook ever so slightly, as if something rested its weight against it. The buzzing fluorescent lights flickered above us, stuttering in uneven rhythms. The air seemed to thicken. Marlene leaned toward me and whispered, "Don't move unless you have to. It listens." Another sound floated through the air, whispered and thin, threading through the quiet like a needle pulling a loose thread. "Help me." My stomach turned. The voice sounded exactly like it had on the trail. But hearing it here, so close to civilization, so close to people, so far from the ridgeline, made something inside my chest twist. Ethan's grip on the tire iron tightened. "That ain't her," he murmured. The voice came again. "Please, don't leave me." The figure's shadow moved across the frosted strip near the bottom of the door. A faint shape, a foot, maybe a hand, drifted into view and then slipped out again. Another knock. This one faster, impatient. Tap, tap, tap. Marlene pulled me by the sleeve, guiding me deeper into the store until we crouched behind one of the aisles. Ethan followed, keeping his eyes locked on the door. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I felt like a child hiding from a nightmare, except this one could track my breaths. The silence stretched, held taut like a string. Then, a soft scrape dragged across the glass, long, slow, like fingernails or claws drawing downward. Ethan pressed his back to the shelf, his jaw clenched. "It don't usually come this far down the mountain," he whispered, voice low. "Whatever it saw in you, whatever scent it picked up." He didn't finish. I tried to breathe quietly, but every inhale felt too loud, too sharp. The store suddenly felt too small, too bright, too exposed. We waited, frozen, listening to the faint scrape drifting along the glass. Then it stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the doorknob rattled. Just once, softly. A test. Marlene pressed her palm to her lips to keep from crying out. Her eyes glistened. "It's learning," she whispered. The knob rattled again, harder this time. The glass door shook in its frame. Ethan surged forward and held the locking bar down, bracing his body against the metal. The rattling intensified, a violent shaking that vibrated through the entire front wall of the store. Ethan grunted, muscles straining. The door creaked, metal bending slightly under an impossible pressure. Then it stopped, all at once. The sudden silence hit like a thunderclap. Ethan kept holding the door, panting, sweat forming along his hairline. "I don't hear it," he muttered. "Don't relax yet," Marlene warned. We waited. Seconds slipped by with excruciating slowness. Then a faint sound echoed from behind us, a sound that did not come from the door. I spun around. The windows at the side of the store were covered only by flimsy posters advertising fishing bait and beer. The sunlight outside dimmed as a shape slid past the glass, just a silhouette, a blur of motion. Then another, and another. Too many. My breath caught. "It's flanking us," Ethan whispered. I felt my pulse drop into a deep, cold part of my stomach. "There's more than one?" Marlene shook her head slowly. "No." That was all she said. No explanation, no details. Just that single word that felt worse than the alternative. The shadow paused at the window again, its head tilted, as if listening, as if scenting the air. Ethan stepped back, raising the tire iron defensively. The shadow moved suddenly, fast, streaking past the next window like a smear of ink. Something slapped against the siding, flat, heavy, unnatural. "It's hunting," Marlene whispered. "Not trying to get in, trying to get you separated from us." The blood drained from my face. I realized with a sickening drop of fear that this thing didn't want us all. It wanted me. The knocking resumed, but now it came from the side of the building. A different pattern this time. Faster, more frantic. Knock, 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 knock. Ethan moved toward the back storage room. "We gotta go," he said. "Now, if it gets inside, we're dead." "But how do we get out?" I hissed. "It's outside every wall." Marlene grabbed my wrist, surprisingly strong, through the back, across the service lane, into the woods on the far side. "It won't expect that." My heart sank. "You want me to go into the woods?" "That's where it came from." "That's exactly why it won't think you'd run there," she said. The logic twisted my stomach, but she was right. The front door rattled again, violently this time. No time to think. Ethan shoved open the back door, revealing a narrow concrete pad lined with dumpsters. Beyond it, a slope led down into thick brush, thorny, tangled, wild. No clear path, no easy footing, but it was our only chance. "Go!" Ethan hissed. As we stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a plunge into deep water. Crisp, sharp, filled with the scent of gasoline from the dumpsters and the cool mountain breeze drifting from the ridge. We hurried across the concrete, shoes scuffing. Marlene pushed me ahead of her, her breaths coming quick and uneven. Behind us, a loud crack, glass shattering. The thing was inside. "Run!" Ethan shouted. We sprinted down the slope, thorns tearing at our clothes, the ground collapsing under our steps. I grabbed branches, roots, anything to keep my balance. The forest felt darker here, the canopy thicker, the undergrowth choking. Marlene tripped behind me. I spun back, grabbing her arm before she hit the ground. She winced but nodded, pushing forward again. Then, from the gas station above us, A scream. Ethan. The kind of scream that tore through the air raw and primal. A sound no one makes unless something truly monstrous stands inches from them. Marlene flinched violently, tears bursting from her eyes. She almost ran back up the slope. No! I grabbed her shoulders. He wanted us to run. She trembled, her resolve breaking. But he saved us. Don't make it for nothing. A new sound emerged from the shattered store, a low, guttural mimicry of Ethan's scream, perfectly repeated. Then again, and again, each repetition more distorted. Marlene covered her ears, sobbing silently. It's learning him now, she whispered. I pulled her down the slope, pushing through brush that snagged at our clothes like grasping fingers. The forest swallowed us quickly, the gas station disappearing behind twists of trees and brambles. But the forest didn't feel empty. Something moved through it. Fast. Quiet. Tracking. I could feel it, like a pressure on the back of my neck, a cold awareness sliding between the trees. Every shadow shifted. Every rustle carried intent. My lungs burned, my legs shook, but I kept moving. The woods grew darker, denser. The branches above knitted tightly, allowing only scraps of light to filter through. What does it want? I choked out. Marlene swallowed hard, wiping tears with the back of her shaking hand. It wants a voice, she whispered. A real one. A life to replace the ones it's lost. A cold realization dropped through me like a stone. And it chose yours. I didn't know how she could be so certain. I didn't want to believe it. But the look in her eyes told me she understood something I didn't, something she'd seen before. Branches snapped behind us. Close. Too close. We ran deeper into the woods, the air getting colder, the shadows stretching. My breath came in ragged gasps. The forest pressed around us like a living thing. Somewhere behind us, echoing faintly through the trees, a whisper floated through the dark. My own voice. Calling my name, the air felt strangely hollow after that scream, like the woods had swallowed the sound and left an aching vacuum behind. I remember standing there, heart pounding in my ribs, mouth dry, flashlight trembling in my hand as Harper whispered my name like she was afraid the trees would hear her. And maybe they would. Maybe every shadow around us was listening. I didn't say anything at first. I couldn't. My brain was working too slowly, too thickly, like it didn't want to accept what that scream implied. I just scanned the dark, watching the fog seep between the pines like something living. The wind had stopped. Even the stream behind our sight, the one that had babbled all night, seemed to hold its breath. When I finally forced myself to turn toward Harper, I saw that she was shaking. Not crying, not panicking, just shaking the way you do when your body realizes something is wrong before your mind does. Her flashlight beam kept darting between the trees. She didn't look at me when she said, "We're not alone out here." And she was right. I'd known it long before that scream, the strange smell earlier, that sour metallic scent that drifted downwind, the knocking that followed us up the ridge, always 3 taps at a time, the way the forest seemed too quiet, too still, too watchful. Still, fear makes you rationalize. It makes you lie to yourself because the truth is too heavy to hold. It was probably a fox, I said, knowing damn well foxes didn't scream like that. Or maybe a hiker slipped. But Harper just shook her head. That wasn't a fall. That was someone terrified. Her voice cracked. She wasn't a dramatic person. She wasn't the kind to stir fear into something bigger. She was level-headed, cautious, the kind of person who double knots her boots and checks weather reports an hour before we pack. If she was scared, something was really wrong. I took a slow breath and stepped closer to her. "Let's go back to the van," I said. "Lock up. Figure out what to do." But she didn't move. She was staring at a point between the trees, a narrow, uneven stretch of darkness where the moonlight didn't quite reach. And before I could follow her gaze, she whispered, "Someone's standing there." My throat locked. I lifted the flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. At first, everything looked normal, just trunks, branches, fog. Then the light caught something pale, a face. Not fully lit, just the suggestion of one, a forehead, a cheek, maybe an eye. Partially hidden behind a tree as if whoever it belonged to was peering around it, watching us, I blinked, and it was gone. But the shape of it stayed imprinted behind my eyelids, too smooth, too motionless, too quiet. Harper grabbed my sleeve, her voice barely a breath. "We need to leave, now." So we moved, slow at first, then faster as the silence pressed harder against our backs. The forest didn't sound natural anymore. It felt staged, like the world had emptied itself of life except for us and whatever had been staring from the darkness. Our boots hit the dirt path. The gravel shifted. The fog followed. And the deeper we went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as though the woods were trying to swallow us in slow, deliberate gulps. Halfway down the trail, we heard it. Footsteps. Not ours. Not animals, human. Crunching leaves behind us. Measured, deliberate. Slow enough to let us know they weren't trying to sneak. Fast enough to let us know they were following. I didn't turn around. I don't think I could have. My mind was split between two impossible truths. If I looked, I might see something I couldn't unsee. And if I didn't look, something might be getting closer. Harper whispered, "Don't stop. Don't run. Just keep walking." And so we did, until the footsteps quickened, closing the distance with a suddenness that jolted my nerves. I spun around then, but the path behind us was empty. No movement, no shape, nothing. Just fog curling through the beam of my flashlight. I felt foolish, embarrassed almost, like my own fear was making me hallucinate. I turned back toward Harper, just as something slammed loudly to our right, a branch snapping, a heavy body shifting. Something big. Harper jumped and grabbed my arm so tightly her nails dug into my skin. What was that? I didn't answer. I couldn't, because as I listened, I realized the sound wasn't just coming from our right anymore. It was circling, slow, wide steps weaving through the trees, pacing us, tracking us. The realization settled over me like cold water. Whatever was out there didn't care about stealth anymore. It wanted us to know it was there. We walked faster. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not because I expected to see something, but because I needed to confirm it wasn't right behind us. And each time I saw nothing but fog, empty forest, stillness. But the footsteps kept following. And then, from somewhere deeper in the trees, we heard a voice. Faint, ragged, almost choked. "Help." I froze. It wasn't a full cry. It wasn't a scream. It was a strained, faltering whisper like someone trying to call out while their mouth was covered. Harper's grip tightened. No, that's not real. I wanted to believe her, but that sound, God, that sound, it was human and desperate and terrified. "Help." This time, it was clearer, closer, and it didn't sound like the same voice that had screamed earlier. This one sounded older, male, barely clinging to consciousness. My instinct fought with itself. Every moral part of me begged to go toward it, while every survival instinct screamed to run the opposite direction. Harper shook her head over and over. Don't fall for it. People don't whisper for help like that. They shout, they scream, they don't hide their voice. And she was right. Something about it was wrong, off, like a recording played through the wrong speaker. I swallowed hard, tasting metal. "We need to get out of the woods," I said. Now. So we kept going, nearly jogging now, the trail growing narrower as the fog thickened around our legs. My breath was loud in my ears, my heart louder. Every few steps I checked behind us. Still nothing. Another voice rose then, a different one, a woman, younger, trembling. "Don't leave me." Harper covered her ears. It's not real, but it sounded real. Too real. It wasn't until the third voice joined, a deep, hoarse growl calling out something unintelligible, that I realized something horrifying. The voices were coming from different directions. Not one person, not two, several, all scattered through the forest like broken pieces of someone's nightmare. Harper and I broke into a full run. The trail curved sharply to the left, and as we rounded the bend, our campsite finally came into view through the trees, the faint glow of the van's interior lights still on from earlier. We sprinted. Branches whipped our arms, rocks slipped under our boots, my lungs burned. The fog parted like curtains as we burst into the clearing. I fumbled with the door handle, yanked it open, and practically shoved Harper inside. I slammed the lock, tossed myself in after her, and hit the other locks so fast I didn't even feel my fingers. For a long moment, we just sat there, breathing hard, listening, waiting. The forest outside was silent again, too silent. Harper whispered, "Do you see anything?" I shook my head. The fog pressed against the windows like something peering in. Shadows moved with the trees, but nothing stepped into the clearing. Nothing approached the van. Nothing breathed too close. And that silence, that deliberate, endless silence, somehow felt worse than the voices. Because silence meant whatever had been following us didn't need to rush. It knew we weren't going anywhere. I reached back and grabbed my keys from the side pocket of my pack. My hands shook so violently they jingled. I leaned forward to put them into the ignition, and the moment the metal touched the slot, something scraped along the outside of the van. A long, slow drag of nails across metal. Harper gasped. I froze. The sound traveled along the driver's side, deliberate, steady, as if tracing the shape of the vehicle. When it reached the back corner, it paused, then tapped. 3 times, the same rhythm we'd heard on the ridge hours earlier. Something inside me broke open then. Not panic, not dread, something deeper. A realization threaded with an old fear I hadn't told Harper about. A fear tied to the reason I wanted to camp here, on this stretch of the Appalachian Trail in the first place. A memory I thought I had buried. And as the tapping echoed through the van, I finally understood. What was out there wasn't random. It wasn't lost. It wasn't wandering. It was calling me back to something I had tried to forget, to someone I had left behind. And I whispered, barely audible, "It knows who I am." The tapping didn't stop right away. It lingered, a slow and deliberate reminder that something stood just inches from the thin sheet of metal separating us from the night. Harper had curled into herself in the passenger seat, hands pressed to her mouth, but her eyes never left the windows. She was waiting to see a face, a silhouette, a smear of something that would finally confirm this wasn't fear twisting our senses. But I already knew it was real, because the cadence of that tapping, I'd heard it before, years ago. In a part of the Appalachian Trail most hikers avoid now, a place where, when I was 19, a friend of mine went missing. His name was Trevor. And before he disappeared, he tapped on the side of my camper 3 times to let me know he was back from a walk. Always the same pattern. Always that same easy rhythm. He never came back from his last walk. For years, I convinced myself those woods had claimed him quickly, mercifully, that I hadn't left him behind, that I hadn't ignored the strange knocking outside my tent that night because I was too tired, too irritated, too eager to pretend we were safe. I told the search team I didn't hear anything. I told myself the same lie until I believed it. But now, as that tapping echoed in the fog outside the van, my breath left me in a violent tremor. Because it was the same pattern. The same tapping. The same call. Harper finally whispered, "It's gone," right? But she didn't believe it, and neither did I. The fog outside was too dense, too unmoving, as if holding its breath, refusing to reveal what might be standing just beyond the glass. I forced myself to lean forward and turn the key in the ignition. The van shuddered to life, headlights cutting through the mist like pale knives. The beams illuminated the empty strip of dirt ahead of us, the narrow trail that led back to the main road. Harper exhaled shakily. "Drive. Just, please drive." I shifted into reverse, eased back, and swung the van around to face the trail. Gravel crackled under the tires. The headlights washed over the trees. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing dead center in the beam of the headlights, maybe 20 feet ahead of us. The same figure I'd glimpsed earlier, half hidden behind a tree, just a pale sliver of a face. Except now it wasn't hiding. It was standing in full view, motionless as if rooted to the earth. The fog clung to its legs, drifting around it like slow steam. I couldn't see its features clearly, too much distortion, too much mist. But I saw the outline. Tall, thin, head tilted, like listening. Harper inhaled sharply, her voice cracking. "Is that?" I cut her off. "Don't look at it." I didn't know why I said that. I didn't know how I knew. But something in my bones, something instinctive, warned me that giving it your full gaze was a mistake. I kept my eyes on its chest instead of its face. And then It moved. Not a step, not a sway. It twisted its neck in an unnatural diagonal motion, like it was trying to force its head into a new angle, to hear us better, to recognize me. Harper whimpered. I put the van into gear and hit the gas. The wheels spun for a heartbeat on the wet dirt before catching. The van lurched forward, and for a terrible second, I thought the figure wasn't going to move, that we were about to plow straight into it. But just before the bumper reached it, the figure stepped backward into the fog. Not running, not startled, just disappearing. We drove. Branches slapped the sides of the van, shadows rushed past the windows, the headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, but everything beyond that tunnel felt alive, like the forest was collapsing in behind us, sealing the path, pushing us out. Harper kept her hands over her ears, head bent low, whispering something silently, maybe a prayer, maybe a plea. I didn't dare slow down. My grip on the wheel felt fused, my shoulders tight, my breath shallow. A mile down the trail, we hit a patch of clearing where the fog thinned. Harper finally lifted her head. I think we're okay. I almost let myself believe it. Almost. But then the van's dashboard lights flickered. Twice. Then stabilized. And the radio, off since the night began, clicked on by itself. A burst of static filled the cabin. I smacked the power button, but it didn't turn off. The static deepened, shifted, warbled like something was trying to form words through the noise. Harper slapped her palms over her ears again. Then the static cut abruptly, and a voice crackled through the speakers. A familiar voice. Male. Breathy. Faint. Don't leave me, Harper screamed. I nearly drove us off the road. The voice repeated, slightly stronger this time. Don't leave me. Again. Again. That word hit me with the force of a blow. My vision blurred. My chest tightened. My thoughts swirled with memories I had buried so deep I thought they'd lost their shape. Trevor. His laugh. His tapping. The night I pretended I heard nothing. The morning I woke to an empty campsite. Harper grabbed my arm. Turn it off! Please turn it off! I yanked the fuse panel open and tore out the radio fuse with my bare fingers. The cabin went silent again. Silent except for my breathing and the sound of my pulse pounding in my ears. We kept going, pushing hard down the narrow dirt road. When the forest finally thinned and the gravel met pavement, I didn't stop. Not until we reached a small gas station lit by a single flickering fluorescent light. I parked. Finally, I let myself breathe. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The buzzing light, the faint hum of distant traffic, normal sounds, felt unreal after what we'd heard. Harper eventually leaned back in her seat, throat tight. Tell me what that was. I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to. Because saying it out loud meant admitting it was real. That something followed us. That something knew me. That something remembered. Trevor, I finally whispered. A friend of mine who went missing out here years ago. Harper's breath hitched. And the tapping. He used to do that. It was his pattern, his signal. Her eyes widened with horror. You think that was him? I shook my head. I think something out there knew his voice, knew his habits, knew how to get my attention. Harper swallowed. Why you? I stared out the windshield at the empty road stretching into the night. Because I didn't answer him last time. Silence followed, heavy, pressing, thick enough to taste. And something inside me shifted. Guilt, long buried, rose like a tide. Fear twisted into a cold clarity. Because the truth was simple. The Appalachian Trail was full of stories. Lost hikers, vanished campers, strange calls in the night. Most people wrote them off as accidents or legends. But some of us knew better. Some of us knew the woods didn't just take people. They kept something of them. The voice, the fear, the last thing they said before they disappeared. Someone had told me once that the mountains along the Appalachian Trail were some of the oldest in the world. That age changes the land, makes it deeper, hungrier. Somewhere in those trees, something collected the echoes of the lost. And tonight it wanted to show me what I'd left behind. Harper wiped her face with shaky hands. Let's go home, she whispered. Let's just get as far from here as possible. I nodded and turned the key again, but as the engine hummed, something cold slid down my spine. Because I realized something terrifying. The voices in the woods had come from all directions, not just Trevor's. There were many, too many. The lost weren't lonely. They were calling, trying to reach someone, trying to be answered. As I pulled away from the gas station lights and the darkness reclaimed the road, one thought kept looping in my mind, refusing to let go. What if the Appalachian Trail didn't just contain the stories of lost hikers? What if it kept their last moments alive? And what if, after all these years, Trevor wasn't calling for help anymore? What if he was calling me back? The road stretched into darkness, and somewhere behind us, deep in the trees, something followed. I don't think anyone forgets the moment they realize the woods are paying attention to them. For me, it happened long before anything actually went wrong, before the fear had a name, before the dark bent itself into the shape of something watching. It started with a feeling, subtle but sharp, like a loose thread in the corner of my mind being tugged by an unseen hand. My name is Elias. I'm 34, and I've been camping alone in my old Volkswagen Westphalia for more than a decade. I grew up believing solitude was supposed to feel peaceful, clean, a kind of silence that resets you. But if you camp long enough, especially alone, especially far from the hum of traffic and porch lights, you eventually learn there's another kind of silence, a heavy one that presses against your ribs like it's checking how strong they are. That's the silence I drove into the night I almost didn't come home. I had parked my Volkswagen deep inside the Klamath foothills of Northern California, following a Forest Service road that barely existed between the ferns and the rain-slicked roots. It wasn't a campground, not formally. You don't go looking for designated sites when you've lived most of your adult life chasing solitude. You go where the road stops, pretending it's a road. You go where you know no one else will follow unless they're lost or looking trouble-shaped. I'd been there 2 nights already, and everything had been normal. Quiet, peaceful even. A creek murmured a short walk downhill, and the air had that damp, metallic smell of moss and cold stone. My only real concern had been the weather, because storms in that part of California tend to boil up fast, not build slowly like they do elsewhere. I liked the volatility, though. It made the world feel alive. On the third evening, something felt different. No dramatic shift, no loud signs, just a faint, prickling drop in the air, like the woods exhaled and forgot to inhale again. The wind died. The temperature dipped slightly, but not enough to blame it. And the quiet felt layered, like something behind it had just stepped out of earshot. I told myself it was nothing. You do that a lot when you camp alone. If you don't learn to soothe your own nerves, every snapping twig becomes a mountain lion, every rustle a stranger with bad intentions. If you run every time your instincts complain, you never get to enjoy the beauty of being alone. But instincts don't just vanish because you decided you're too experienced to listen. That night, while I was heating water for tea on my portable stove, I caught movement at the edge of my vision, something pale slipping behind a tree. When I turned toward it, there was nothing but bark, slick with moisture and shadow. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening, waiting. The woods remained quiet. I forced a slow breath out through my nose and returned to the stove. It wasn't until the water began steaming that I heard the first sound, soft footsteps on wet soil. Human footsteps. At least that's what they sounded like, slow, careful, deliberate. I froze, my hand hovering above the kettle. 3 steps, then silence. My pulse jumped into my throat. There were no other cars, no tire tracks coming in behind mine. I hadn't seen another person since I'd turned off the highway. I reminded myself that people still wandered these woods sometimes, hunters or hikers or drifters passing through. But it was nearly midnight. A lantern hung from a branch near my van, throwing a warm, trembling glow across the clearing. And if someone were approaching openly, they would have called out, or approached from the trail, not from the darkness in the trees. I turned off the stove and quietly moved the kettle aside. The footsteps didn't come back. But something about the silence, the stillness of it, felt like a held breath. I spoke up, forcing my voice to sound casual. "Hey there. Just me out here. If you need help, let me know." Nothing. I waited another full minute before I finally ducked into my van and slid the door shut. I locked it. I told myself not to feel embarrassed about doing it. I made tea with shaking hands and pressed my back against the passenger seat and then staring through the windshield at the dark gap between the trees. Every now and then, the lantern outside swayed gently, enough wind to move it, nothing else. By 1 a.m., unease gave way to tension. Not a spike, just a slow, creeping awareness that something in the forest had shifted, as if the night had taken a step closer to my van. I didn't hear footsteps again, but I felt observed. It didn't make sense, and I hate saying that because it makes me sound paranoid. But camping alone teaches you what natural attention feels like. Animals, weather, movement of branches. This wasn't that. This felt like focus. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into the upper bunk and wrapped myself in the sleeping bag, listening, waiting. The rain started around 2 a.m., soft at first, then heavier, its rhythm steady and comforting. I remember thinking that the sound of rain, at the very least, would make the feeling of being watched fade. But it didn't. At some point, I fell asleep for maybe an hour, maybe less. I woke to the unmistakable sound of something brushing against the rear panel of the van. Not a tree limb, not rain. Something dragging lightly across the metal, slow enough that I felt it in my teeth. I sat up so fast I cracked my head on the roof. The rain had stopped. The lantern outside was still glowing, though faintly now, its battery nearly spent. Through the fogged window, I couldn't see anything but my own warped reflection. My breath came shallow and loud in the space around me. Then the sound came again. Drag, pause, drag, like fingers. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My entire body locked into place, listening harder than I've ever listened in my life. The dragging sound circled from the back of the van toward the sliding door. Slow, patient. I knew two things in that moment. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. And it already knew I was awake. For a few seconds, maybe longer, I debated calling out. Maybe it was someone who needed help. Maybe it was someone drunk, lost, confused. But no lost, confused person drags their fingertips along the side of a stranger's van like they're tracing the shape of the thing inside. I reached for the flashlight. Then the dragging stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been. I felt pressure building at my temples, the way you feel when someone is standing a foot behind you, leaning in, waiting to see what you'll do next. I wanted to look. I wanted to check the window, confirm what my brain was screaming wasn't real. But before I could move, a new sound rattled through the frame of the van. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Not loud, not aggressive, soft, polite. Right against the sliding door. I swallowed, tasting metal on my tongue, and then a voice, not fully a whisper, but close, slid through the thin gap between the door and the frame. "Elias, open up." My blood went cold. No one knew I was here. No one knew my name. And the voice wasn't familiar. It wasn't quite right, like each syllable had been shaped by someone still learning how human speech worked. My entire body trembled as the voice pressed closer. "Let me in." For a few seconds, all I could hear was the faint buzz of the dying lantern outside and the violent thudding of my own heartbeat in my ears. The voice had come from no more than a few inches away, close enough that if I'd reached out, my hand would have touched the place where the sound vibrated through the thin metal skin of my van. I didn't answer. Couldn't. A thin mist of breath fogged the inside of the window beside the sliding door. My hands shook as I lowered myself from the bunk as quietly as I could. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to speak, not to move, not to let whatever was out there know exactly where I was inside the van. The voice didn't come again immediately. Instead, something pressed gently against the door, one soft, testing push, like a hand flattening against it, feeling for weakness. My knees tightened and I slid behind the driver's seat, pressing into the narrow shadow where I could still see the door, but where the windows didn't expose me. The van felt suddenly too small, too thin, like a tent barely holding out a storm. Another gentle push. then a shift in the gravel beneath slow-moving feet. I clenched my jaw, waiting. Finally, the voice came back, too soft, too smooth, like someone had practiced my name 100 times but never learned the right rhythm. Yes. Open the door. I squeezed my eyes shut. The way it said my name didn't fit the cadence of any accent I'd ever heard. It stretched the vowels wrong, clipped the consonants too sharply. A human voice forced through a shape that didn't quite fit. I forced myself to swallow and stay silent. The voice shifted closer, almost touching the frame now. I'm cold. I still didn't answer. A pause. Then the voice said a new sentence that made the hairs on my arms rise straight up. You slept for 1 hour. I was watching. My spine went rigid. I hadn't checked the exact time, but that was about right. I dozed off for what felt like an hour. But how could something outside know that? A faint scrape traced across the van wall again, higher this time, like a hand gliding along the metal at shoulder height. I crouched deeper behind the seat, hardly breathing, praying the lantern outside would die soon so it couldn't cast my shadow. If the person wanted to break in, they would have done it. This wasn't a break-in. This was something slower, something patient, something that didn't need to force anything because it expected me to let it in. Another knock, still gentle, still wrong. Elias, we talked earlier. Remember? No, we hadn't. I would have remembered that voice no matter how tired I'd been. But the statement told me something I hadn't considered yet. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to convince me. I steadied my breathing, forcing the panic back down. Fear makes noise. Noise gets you killed. I knew this from years of camping alone, from knowing when to trust instinct over rational thought. There are sounds the forest makes because it's alive, and there are sounds the forest makes when something in it has decided you're alone enough to approach. The thing outside stepped closer. I heard the faint rub of fabric, or something close to fabric. You asked for help earlier, the voice murmured. My blood froze. I had spoken earlier. When those first footsteps came near my campsite, I'd said, "If you need help, let me know." I'd said the words to the dark, and something in the dark had heard them. I fought the urge to run to the driver's seat and start the engine. The problem with starting the Volkswagen in a moment like this was simple. It would require me to move through shadow and stand in front of the window. The movement might trigger something on the other side of the glass. And if the engine didn't turn over immediately, which old vans are notorious for, it would be worse. I needed a plan. I needed quiet. And most of all, I needed time. The voice slid lower, as if crouching to peer under the van, though the bottom gap was less than 3 inches. I can see your feet. But it couldn't. I pulled them up tight beneath me, hidden behind the seat frame where no angle of the outside could reach. Still, hearing those words nearly made a sound slip from my throat. Fear wasn't creeping anymore. It was rushing up in waves, building toward something sharp. I exhaled once, silently. Then everything outside went still. Not quiet. Still. A complete absence of motion, breath, sound. Even the lantern's glow stopped flickering, like the air around it had frozen in place. A moment later, something tapped just once against the glass of the driver's side window. Not the sliding door, not the rear panel, right next to me. I jerked back so violently I hit the metal seat frame behind me. The flashlight nearly slipped from my hands as I scrambled deeper into the shadows. Tap. Another one, soft but intentional, too gentle to be animal, too precise. I lifted the flashlight without turning it on. I waited, eyes fixed on the window. Then a face appeared. Not full, not clear, just the distorted blur of something pale pressed too close to the glass for the weak lantern light to reveal its details. A cheek, part of a nose, a smudge of a mouth. But the angle was wrong, far too low to be someone standing. It was positioned like the person was lying sideways against the window, pressed horizontally, as though gravity didn't apply. A faint, warped whisper seeped through the glass. "Why are you hiding?" My throat tightened so hard it hurt. The face didn't blink, didn't shift. It stayed pressed against the glass as if waiting for me to respond. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After an agonizing stretch of seconds, the face lifted away from the glass without peeling or shifting like human skin does. It lifted in a single fluid motion, silent, effortless. The steps that followed were no longer careful. They were slow, soft, but purposeful, circling back toward the sliding door again. I had the sickening sense that whatever it was had grown impatient. A shadow passed across the lantern light. Then fingers curled over the edge of the small ventilation window, the one I had cracked open earlier to let the steam out from boiling water. I stared horrified as the fingers tried to slip inside. Thin fingers. Too thin. The tips tapped lightly against the metal frame, groping, testing, searching for leverage to pry it wider. I snapped into action. I lunged forward and slammed the latch shut with every ounce of strength I had. The moment it clicked, the fingers recoiled, not like something hurt, but like something offended. A low sound followed, something like a breath, but wrong, a dragging inhale shaped like imitation. Then it spoke again. "You're making this difficult, Elias." The calmness of the voice hit harder than any threat could have. It wasn't angry. It wasn't frustrated. It sounded disappointed. My hands shook as I backed away again, gripping the flashlight until the plastic casing creaked. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, something answered with a low, rising call, too deep to be a coyote, too resonant to be human. Whatever was outside my van wasn't alone, and it no longer sounded patient. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing with absolute bone-deep certainty. If I didn't leave soon, I wasn't going to leave at all. I steadied myself against the van's thin interior wall, trying to slow the sharp panic rising in my chest. Every survival instinct I had was screaming the same thing: move. Not yet drive, not yet, because any loud noise or sudden motion might push whatever was out there into its next decision. But I had to reposition, had to think. Rainwater from earlier still clung to the metal roof, and the damp smell of moss drifted through the cracks. I could hear the faint drip of water sliding down the back hatch, steady, mundane, natural. Every other sound out there was not. The dragging breath came again, closer than before, almost directly beside me except outside the metal. I pressed my palm against the van's cool interior wall and felt the faintest vibration, like something was leaning against it. I crept toward the front seats again, staying as low as possible and moving only when the wind rustled the leaves outside. If I was going to get out of this, I had one chance. The keys were still in the small cup holder beside the handbrake. Starting the van was loud. Doors unlocking were louder. But driving offered distance, and distance meant survival. I inched closer. That was when the thing outside let out a sound that did not belong to any living creature I had ever heard. A mimic of speech, but stretched and thinned as if someone had wrung the warm tones out of it until only a hollow, breathy echo remained. "I know you're moving." I froze mid-crawl. The way it said it was not accusatory. It was gentle, informative, as if it wanted to help me understand something. The lantern outside finally sputtered and died, leaving the forest pressed against the van like a single solid sheet of black. For a moment, complete darkness wrapped the clearing. The only light came from the faint glow of my battery gauge on the dashboard, barely enough to outline the front seats in a soft, ghostly blue. My breath sounded too loud in the silence, and I covered my mouth with my sleeve, trying to muffle it. Wind pushed through the treetops again, but the movement did not soothe me. It masked things, hid sounds, blurred what was natural and what was not. My mind pushed up memories I did not want, near misses from past trips, nights when I had heard a branch snap too close or footsteps that did not belong, nights where fear came and went without revealing its source. But this was different. The presence outside the van was not passing through. It was choosing to be here. Another tap at the side panel, this time harder. Then another. 3 taps, each separated by a slow count in my head. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. Something was testing how I reacted to pressure, testing how far the metal would bend. Maybe how far I would bend. I slid up into the driver's seat as quietly as I could and closed my fingers around the keys. They were cold, almost unnervingly cold, as if even the objects in here were absorbing the fear. I did not turn them. Not yet. Outside, something moved away from the van. Soft steps, measured, moving toward the front, then stopping. The windshield was too fogged from my breath and adrenaline to see clearly. A shape might have been there. Or maybe the darkness itself had thickened. A moment later, the lowest whisper I had ever heard pressed through the cracks near the driver's window. Don't go. Simple words. A request more than a command. Something in the tone hit a place deep inside my chest I did not want to acknowledge. It sounded lonely. Wrong. Like it did not understand the rules of fear or caution, but recognized the shape of separation. I felt myself hesitate. Not because I trusted it, but because part of me had the instinctive human reaction to answer, to say something, anything. The pause was a mistake. The whisper sharpened. I said, "Don't go." The way it said the second part did not sound like loneliness. It sounded like recognition, as if something in the woods had marked me long before tonight. Panic surged hard enough to blur the edges of my vision. My hand twisted the ignition before I even consciously commanded it. The starter clicked once, too weak, then again. A third time. Come on, come on. The engine coughed to life with a disgruntled roar. The reaction outside the van was immediate. Feet, too many, too fast, scrambled against the wet soil as if multiple shapes repositioned at once. Shadows moved behind the fogged windshield, blotting out the faint ambient light like something was stepping into my view. The passenger side handle jerked violently. Once, twice, then harder. I slammed my palm onto the lock button and threw the stick into first gear. The tires spun uselessly in the mud-slicked ground at first, digging shallow grooves and spitting wet earth against the rear panel. Something struck the side of the van, a flat, open-handed slap that reverberated through the frame like a stone dropped into metal. My heart nearly stopped. The wheels caught. The van lurched forward. Branches whipped along the front panel as I forced the Volkswagen down the narrow Forest Service road. The headlights carved trembling tunnels of pale light between the trees, but visibility was terrible. Fog rising from the wet ground, steam lifting off the engine, darkness folding itself between the trunks. I did not care. I accelerated. The van shuddered as the tires stumbled over roots and rocks, but I held the wheel with a grip that felt carved from bone. I could still hear something behind me, a sound that rose and fell. Not quite a scream, not quite a call, but something that wanted to sound human and could not. Something that followed. The forest thinned for a moment near a bend, and the moon slipped through just long enough to illuminate something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing perfectly still in the center of the road, head tilted, arms too long, shoulders too narrow. Watching me drive away, the image blurred as the van hit another rut and bounced, jerking the mirror aside. I did not reach to fix it. I did not want to see anything again. The road twisted sharply. I followed its instinctive memory of turns because the headlights were not enough now. My surroundings blurred into streaks of bark and wet leaves as the descent carried me lower and lower into the valley. The air warmed slightly as the altitude dropped, but the cold inside me did not budge. Halfway down the road, the van's engine sputtered. No, no, no. I feathered the gas. The engine hesitated, choked, then caught again. Old vans sometimes did that, especially after a hard start. But I could not shake the sense that if the engine died here, if it failed even once, whatever was following would finally catch up. I did not look back, did not blink, did not slow down. When I finally reached the junction to the main gravel road, I nearly overshot days, skidding sideways before yanking the wheel and pushing onto the wider stretch. The van bounced, fishtailed slightly, but stayed upright. I pressed the accelerator, letting the road put distance between me and the deeper woods. For several long minutes, I drove with every muscle in my body locked in place, waiting to hear footsteps pounding beside me or something slamming into the rear panel. Waiting to see that figure standing around the next curve. But nothing appeared. The sound of pursuit faded. The forest became just forest again. The fear did not fade, though. It settled deeper, shifting from panic to something colder, sharper, something that made me question the boundary between instinct and reality, between what I believed about the woods and what the woods knew about me. When I finally reached the paved highway, I did not stop. I did not check the rearview mirror. I did not even slow down. I drove south until the first motel sign flickered into view like a beacon. And even then, I sat in the parking lot for 10 full minutes before I could convince myself to step out of the van. As I did, the wind carried a sharp, wet smell through the air: mud, moss, pine, and something faintly metallic. I froze, because that was the exact smell that had clung to my van's walls moments before the voice said my name. And the night around me felt aware. I didn't unload anything from the van when I walked into that motel room. Didn't grab my duffel bag, didn't bother locking the passenger door behind me, didn't even check if anyone else was staying in the building. I just stepped inside, shut the door, and leaned my full weight against it, like the wood alone could keep the night from following me. The room smelled like stale detergent and mildew. The carpet was worn thin enough to show the concrete beneath in patches. A single dim lamp beside the bed flickered each time the heater kicked on. It should have felt safe. Walls, locks, lights, all the things you take for granted in civilization. But the fear didn't stay behind in the woods. It came with me. I sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on my knees, hands clasped so tightly that the veins stood up like cords. My heartbeat felt lodged between my teeth. My breaths were shallow, uneven. Every sound in the room, the click of the heater, the drip of the faucet, felt amplified and wrong. I kept telling myself I was inside now. I was out of the forest. I was supposed to be fine. But the truth was sharper. I didn't feel alone. Not really. The motel window was covered by a heavy green curtain, the kind that absorbs sound more than it blocks it. I hadn't looked outside since I arrived. I couldn't shake the image of that pale face pressed to the glass of my van. Too close, too still. If something like that appeared here, in a room meant for sleep and safety, I wasn't sure I had anything left inside to fight with. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer. My thoughts kept drifting back to what happened the moment before the engine finally caught. The slap against the van. The voice saying my name like it had known me for years. And the figure in the road, the way it just stood there as if the darkness carved it out with a knife. I rubbed my palms over my face, trying to ground myself. You're safe now. You're overreacting. You're tired. But another part of me, older, instinctive, the same part that had gotten me through a decade of solo camping, was whispering something different. It didn't stop because you drove away. I stood and crossed the room to the sink. The tap sputtered before producing a thin stream of brownish water. I splashed some onto my face and watched it drip into the basin. My reflection looked hollow, pale. The fear had carved shadows beneath my eyes that made me look older, worn down. I turned off the faucet and listened. The heater clicked on again. A car door shut somewhere outside. A muffled voice from the room next door. All normal things, all ordinary. But underneath them was something else, a faint rhythm, soft and slow, like fingertips brushing against fabric. I stiffened. The sound was coming from the curtain. I stared at it without moving, without blinking, waiting for the rational part of my mind to explain it away. Air pressure? Draft? My own imagination feeding on exhaustion? All possibilities, all logical, none convincing. I stepped backward until my calves hit the bed frame. The sound grew a little louder, just barely. A soft glide, up and down, not tugging, not tapping, feeling. Like something was on the other side, running its fingers across the cheap motel curtain the same way it had dragged them across the metal of my van. The room felt suddenly smaller, like the walls had leaned inward. I swallowed, and then the sound stopped. Silence thickened in the space where breath should have been. My pulse hammered against my throat, threatening to choke me. The air felt colder by the second, heavy and metallic like the chill that settles before a storm. I whispered, barely audible even to myself, "Please, don't be there." The moment the words left my mouth, the curtain moved, just an inch, just enough to shift the fabric. Something pressed against it from the outside. Not a face this time, not a hand, a shape, bent, waiting. Every muscle in my body seized. The room spun, my vision tunneled. It barely registered that I had grabbed my keys from the nightstand. I don't remember reaching, I just suddenly had them clutched in my fist. My body worked faster than my thoughts. I backed toward the door, eyes locked on the curtain. The shape didn't move again, didn't retreat, didn't reveal itself. It just stayed pressed there, listening, maybe, testing, waiting for me to freeze instead of run. I fumbled with the door lock, nearly dropping the keys. When the metal finally clicked, I wrenched the door open and stumbled out into the cold night air. It was after 3 a.m. The parking lot was empty except for my Volkswagen and a truck on the far side. The fluorescent motel lights flickered overhead, buzzing faintly against the quiet. Every inch of me wanted to turn back and check the window, to see if the shape moved or vanished. But I didn't look. I couldn't. I sprinted to the van, forced the key into the door, threw myself inside, locked it, and started the engine. The ignition caught faster than it had earlier, like even the van could feel it, the urgency, the threat. I pulled out of the parking lot, tires grinding against the gravel. When I passed the row of rooms, I stared straight ahead. But in the corner of my eye, I saw the curtain flutter. Just once, like something had slipped away before I could catch its outline. I drove without stopping. Interstate signs blurred past. The sky eventually began to pale with the early traces of dawn, but it didn't calm me. Every time I blinked, I saw the road lit by moonlight, saw the figure standing still in the forest clearing, saw the pale smear of a face pressed horizontally against my window. By the time I reached a gas station 2 towns over, sunlight had taken over completely. A few travelers wandered the aisles inside. A man in a flannel shirt washed his hands at the restroom sink. The world looked normal again. Too normal. Like the night had folded itself away and taken its secrets with it. I leaned on the counter and asked the attendant if they'd heard anything strange through the grapevine about the woods in the Klamath foothills. He didn't hesitate, didn't laugh or shrug or look confused. He just said, "You went up there alone?" I nodded. He let out a soft breath, shook his head, and muttered, "People hear things out there. Things that sound like folks they know, or folks they knew. Woods that old, they don't forget." I didn't ask more. I didn't need to. Because deep down, beneath the fear and the disbelief and the shaking adrenaline, I already knew something had chosen me that night. Something that wasn't finished just because I had driven out of its reach. Some experiences don't let you go. They leave marks you can't see, marks you feel every time you close your eyes or hear a sound that isn't supposed to be there. I still camp in my Volkswagen, still seek the solitude of American forests, still find peace in the rustle of wind through the trees, but I don't ignore my instincts anymore. If the woods ever go quiet in that heavy waiting way, if I ever sense the silence leaning in, if something ever speaks my name from outside the thin metal walls of my home on wheels, I won't hesitate. I'll get in the driver's seat, I'll turn the key, I'll leave before the whisper reaches the door. Because some nights, when you camp alone, you don't get a second chance to survive the first warning. And I was lucky. Terrifyingly, impossibly lucky. I should have turned around the moment the silence started to feel heavy, the kind of quiet that settles on your shoulders like a damp cloth, reminding you that some places weren't meant to be lived in anymore. I'd driven my old Volkswagen Westphalia through enough forgotten stretches of the American West to know when a place was past dead. But that evening, somewhere along a dirt road outside a half-mapped patch of Nevada high desert, I ignored my instincts. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself I was tired. I told myself it was just another empty mining town like the dozens I'd camped near before. And for most of the drive, I believed it. My name's Aaron, I'm 34, and I've been camping out of my Volkswagen since my early 20s, long before it was a trend or an aesthetic. I do it because the silence calms me, because the road is the only place I ever feel like my chest can fully expand, because national forests feel more honest than most people I've ever known. But that night, when I rolled into Hollow Creek, a ghost town the internet barely seemed to acknowledge, that silence felt different. It wasn't calming. It felt listened to. The sun had already dipped low enough that the temperature dropped fast, making the windows of the van sweat with condensation. Hollow Creek sat on the far side of a narrow wash. Just a handful of faded wooden buildings slumped toward the same direction, like they were bracing against a wind that had long stopped blowing. No lights, no signs, no markers, just empty. I parked near what had once been a general store, a structure missing half its roof and most of its front windows. When I stepped outside, the gravel under my boots sounded too loud, like the ground was exaggerating each step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing near the edge of one of the buildings, watching. But no one was there, just my imagination. It had to be. I busied myself with setting up camp, mostly to drown out the uneasy feeling with something familiar. I leveled the van, popped the top, cracked open a beer, and tried to let the stillness become background noise. But even then, something felt off. Usually, abandoned town's echo. A little wind, a loose sheet of metal rattling, a bird nesting somewhere in the rafters. Normal. But here, there was nothing. No wind through the canyon, no insects, no distant trucks. Nothing but the faint hum of my refrigerator and my own heartbeat. After dinner, I decided to walk around the perimeter of the town with my headlamp, partly for exploration, partly because I was trying to prove to myself that the unease didn't own me. The dirt road leading out of town forked unexpectedly, one branch curling behind a hill I hadn't noticed when I drove in. That was odd. Google Maps hadn't shown it. I pointed my light toward it, but the beam felt weak, like the darkness was absorbing it faster than it should. I turned back to camp, deciding I didn't need to wander too far. When I got back to the van, I paused. Something small and metallic was lying on in front of the sliding door. I crouched down. A key. Old brass, worn smooth with age. I hadn't dropped it. I didn't own anything that looked like it. I scanned the area with my headlamp. Nothing but empty buildings and silent doorways. I tried to laugh it off. Towns like this were littered with debris. The wind could have rolled it over, except there had been no wind. None at all. I pocketed the key without knowing why, locked up the van, and climbed into the top bunk. Usually, it only takes me a few minutes to fall asleep, but that night, every small noise felt amplified. The faint ticking of the engine cooling, the creak of the pop-top canvas shifting as the temperature dropped further. Even my breathing sounded unnatural, too loud in the confined space, like I was trying to convince myself I was still there. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even threatening at first. Just a soft, distant tapping. Slow, steady. Almost like someone knocking politely. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. I lay perfectly still, listening. Sometimes in isolated places, the cold causes things to contract, making old wood pop or metal ping. But this sound wasn't sharp. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, patterned. My throat tightened. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The van lit up in a harsh beam, but the sound stopped instantly, like someone had been waiting for me to notice. I held my breath, scanning the windows. Nothing. For a moment, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that it was a dream blending into reality. But as I lowered the flashlight, the tapping started again. This time, closer, softer, as if someone was testing the walls of the van with the tips of their fingers. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Instinct told me not to move, not to speak, not to breathe too loudly. I slid silently down from the top bunk and crouched on the lower level, listening. The tapping circled the van, first on the rear quarter panel, then behind the driver's door, then near the sliding door. Someone was outside, but when I peered out the back window, letting the condensation clear enough to see, there were no footprints in the frost. No shadow moving between the buildings. Nothing at all. Just the tapping. Slow. Even. Intentional. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my palms. I reached for the keys, ready to start the engine and leave if I had to, but something in me hesitated. If someone really was out there, stepping into the driver's seat might expose me. Maybe it was better to wait. Maybe it was better to let whoever or whatever it was lose interest. I stayed there, crouched and listening, while the tapping moved to the very front of the van. It sounded like it was coming from inches away, right beneath the windshield. I could almost picture someone leaning in close, tapping with a single finger. 3 taps. Pause. But then suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence rushed back in, thicker and heavier than before, and for a moment I wondered if the quiet itself had weight. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I paced the inside of the Volkswagen, checking windows, checking locks, waiting for dawn. Every few minutes I thought I heard something, footsteps on gravel, a whisper near the door. But each time I looked, nothing changed. Nothing moved. When the first hint of pink hit the horizon, I felt like I could breathe again. I slid open the side door slowly, half expecting someone to be standing there, but the desert was empty, still and unmoving, except for one detail. There were marks in the frost on the windshield. Small, circular, the size of fingertips. 3 of them, perfectly spaced. I wiped them away with my sleeve, but they smeared, streaking across the glass. That was when I knew whatever had knocked on my van wasn't gone. It had simply moved somewhere I couldn't see. I didn't pack up right away. I should have. Anyone else would have. But something in me needed answers, maybe because fear wasn't the only thing in my chest that morning. Curiosity can be its own kind of trap, and in ghost towns like Hollow Creek, curiosity feels like a voice calling your name from a dark room you swore you'd never enter, and I stepped toward it anyway. The first thing I noticed when I walked the town again that morning was how different everything looked in daylight. The buildings didn't loom as much, the streets didn't seem as narrow, the air even felt warmer, though still dry enough to crack your lips. But the silence, that hadn't changed. If anything, it felt even more unnatural in the sun, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I stepped carefully between the old storefronts, scanning the dirt for footprints that might explain the tapping from the night before. Nothing. Not even my own tracks from the previous evening. The frost had erased everything. It bothered me more than it should have. I kept picturing those fingertip marks on the windshield. 3. Perfectly spaced. Not smeared like animal prints. Not dusty like wind-blown debris. Human-shaped. Clean. Intentional. I told myself I just needed to understand the layout of the town before deciding whether to leave. That was the lie I kept wrapping myself in. The truth was simpler and much more dangerous. I needed to know whether I was alone. I wandered past the general store toward a row of small houses. Most of them were nothing more than wood skeletons, roofs caved in, windows shattered. One still had its door attached, though it hung crooked on rusted hinges. I pushed it open with 2 fingers, expecting it to fall off completely, but it held. Inside, the air smelled faintly of metal and something else, something sweet, almost floral, but rotten at the edges. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and stepped inside. The floors were coated in dust, except for a single path, a narrow strip of clean wood leading from the doorway to the far wall, and then disappearing behind a collapsed beam. I crouched down and squinted. There were no footprints, no boot marks, no dragging lines. Just a clean track through dust with crisp edges, like something had slid through without touching the floor on either side. My skin prickled. I backed out slowly, careful not to disturb anything. When I stepped into the sunlight again, I felt the silence shift, as if the town had just watched me discover something I wasn't supposed to. I didn't like how that thought made my stomach tighten. Deciding I needed air, real air, moving air, I walked toward the fork in the road I had noticed the night before. In daylight, it was easier to see that the right-hand path curled behind a ridge of rock and disappeared out of sight. No tire tracks, no footprints, no indication anyone had used it in years. Still, something about it tugged at me, maybe the same instinct that had kept me awake all night. maybe the key in my pocket, which I kept touching unconsciously. It felt like a puzzle piece that belonged somewhere in this town, and part of me believed whatever weighted down that path would explain everything. I followed it. The road wound gently upward, and as I climbed, the view of Hollow Creek widened behind me, a cluster of dying buildings surrounded by an ocean of desert. From up here, the town looked even smaller, even more alone, like a forgotten scar on the land. I paused halfway up the trail, turning to scan the windows below. And that's when I saw it. In one of the second-story windows of the old general store, a shape moved. Not quickly, not sharply, just a slow shift, like someone leaning slightly to one side. I blinked hard, wiped my eyes, and looked again. The window was empty, but the chill running down my back didn't fade. Someone or something had been watching. I should have turned around then, should have driven off and never looked back. But fear has a strange way of pulling you forward instead of pushing you away. It makes you want answers. It makes you desperate not to be the fool who fled from shadows. So I kept walking. The path ended abruptly at a low, rusted chain stretched across two metal posts. Behind it, partially hidden by a rock face, sat a boarded-up mine shaft. The boards were weathered, but the nails looked too new. Someone had sealed it recently. And carved along the closest beam, faint, almost erased by wind, were 3 small circles in a triangular pattern. The exact shape of the fingertip marks on my windshield. My heartbeat stuttered. I stepped closer, brushing my fingers lightly across the carved circles. The wood around them was splintered, gouged as if someone had dug their nails into the surface with force. The boards covering the entrance felt colder than the air around them, like something behind them had chilled the wood from the inside out. That was when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Not from the boards, not from the ground, from behind me. I froze, every muscle turning rigid. The tapping was soft, close, impossibly close. I could almost feel the vibration of it in my spine. Slowly, I turned my head. Nothing was there. No one. Just the empty path winding back toward town. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved. Not around me this time. Above me. I stepped back instinctively, eyes tracing the rock ridge overhead. The stone face was smooth, no ledges, no trees, no hiding places. Yet the tapping continued. Methodical even, patient. Like whatever made the sound didn't care whether I could see it or not. It only cared that I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. My throat tightened so much it felt like my breath was trapped there. I didn't run, not yet, but my body vibrated with the urge to. The tapping grew faint, drifting along the ridge until it vanished altogether. When the silence returned, it felt triumphant, as if the town itself were pleased. I backed away from the mine, almost tripping over a loose stone. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought surfaced. Unwelcome and unavoidable. Something was sealed behind those boards for a reason. When I reached the bottom of the trail, I could see my van again. Its faded paint, the dent in the bumper, the cracked skylight, all of it felt suddenly fragile. Too fragile. A thin barrier between me and whatever Hollow Creek was keeping buried. As I approached, my footsteps slowed. The sliding door was ajar. I hadn't left it like that. My chest tightened violently, and for several seconds, all I could do was stand there and stare at the thin black gap between the door and the frame. I didn't want to look inside. I didn't want to confirm the thought clawing at the back of my mind. But I stepped forward. The inside of the van looked normal at first. My sleeping bag was where I left it. My backpack remained zipped. My lantern sat on the counter, but the air inside was wrong. Cold. Not desert morning cold. Not shade cold. Deep cold, like the kind that seeps out of abandoned freezers. Then I saw it. On the small fold-out table, placed carefully at the center like a gift, was a second brass key, identical to the one in my pocket. And below it, drawn with a fingertip in a thin layer of frost that hadn't been there before, were 3 circles in a triangle. My vision tunneled. Every instinct I'd ignored for the past 12 hours screamed at me in one voice, leave. I grabbed the keys, slammed the door shut, and threw myself into the driver's seat. My hands shook so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition, But when the engine finally roared to life, the van vibrated like it wanted to bolt. And I did too. I turned the wheel sharply, gravel spraying behind me as I gunned the Volkswagen back toward the entrance of Hollow Creek. I didn't look back. Not at the buildings, not at the ridge, not at the mine. But halfway down the road, just before the town disappeared from my rearview mirror, something moved behind the general store. Something tall, something pale, something that stopped moving the instant I saw it. I blinked, and it was gone. And yet the cold in the van didn't lift, not even a little. I kept driving, and the silence followed me. I parked the old Volkswagen near the edge of Black Pine Gorge just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The canyon swallowed the light, and everything beyond the hood of my van seemed to melt into shadow. The air smelled dry but strangely metallic, like iron left out to rust, and the wind carried a low, hollow whistle through the pines, soft but insistent. I'd been chasing solitude for months, using this road trip as a way to clear my head, but even as I unloaded my gear, I felt the usual thrill of being out here twist into something tighter, something almost expectant. I hadn't planned to stay long, just a night, maybe two, but the trail map I had printed off some blog that's now gone insisted there was a small clearing near the river, marked by a hand-drawn lantern symbol I didn't remember seeing anywhere else. The more I looked at it, the less sense it made. On paper, the path curved gently, hugging the edge of the gorge. In reality, the trail dropped sharply, rocks jutting out like broken teeth. I shrugged, telling myself maps were never exact, especially for trails that had been neglected for years. Still, the unease stuck, lingering behind my eyes like static in a poorly tuned radio. I set up camp quickly, just the basics: stove, water, lanterns. I've always liked camping alone. It gives me a rhythm, a sense of control. Yet tonight, even the simple act of pulling my sleeping bag from the van felt heavy, as if the shadows were pressing down, wanting me to hurry and finish before they made up their mind about me. When I lit my first lantern, its glow pushed against the darkness, sharp and warm against the creeping chill. That's when I noticed it, the way the trees seemed to bend slightly, leaning toward the clearing, almost listening. A trick of the light, I told myself, or maybe just nerves. The first night wasn't quiet, not in the usual sense anyway. There were noises that shouldn't exist this close to camp, twigs snapping in patterns that resembled footsteps, a distant murmur that didn't belong to the wind, and a faint, recurring smell, burnt pine mixed with something sweet, like candle rolling over me in waves. I woke more than once, staring at the dark, trying to convince myself that the shadows weren't moving. They always seemed just a little too tall, too symmetrical, but I closed my eyes and told myself I was imagining it. That's what I do, I guess, try to argue with the forest. By the second day, I started noticing the lights. At first, they were distant pinpricks between the trees, orange and swinging gently, like lanterns carried by someone walking slowly down the gorge. I convinced myself they were hikers. There's always someone else who sneaks into these places. But when I tried to call out, the wind swallowed my voice. It didn't carry far enough to reach anything. And when I looked back at my van later, parked just as I left it, I could have sworn the lights had moved closer. Not in a straight line, but in the way a human might walk. Staggered, uneven, deliberate. I considered hiking out, but part of me wanted to see it. That quiet, gnawing curiosity you get in the woods, where your brain knows something is off, but it also wants to know why. I'd read a forum post years ago, now deleted, about lights in the Black Pine area that moved against gravity, lights that sometimes appeared in multiple places at once. The author mentioned a carved stone halfway up a ridge, marked with a spiral I'd seen on a smaller trail sign near my campsite. The post was gone now, replaced by a blank page. Nothing, no explanation, just a vanished entry. I kept thinking of that spiral as I wandered closer to the river that day, wondering if it meant anything, or if I'd just convinced myself to notice it. By mid-afternoon, the sun had begun its slow crawl toward the horizon, and the wind picked up again, tugging at my jacket like it had a mind of its own. I stopped along the river's bend to take a sip of water, and that's when I first heard the whisper, soft, human sounding, coming from behind the tree line. Don't follow. Just like that. No echo, no doubling, just words carried directly to me. I froze, my throat dry, my hand clutching the water bottle so tightly it cut into my palm. The wind was still for a brief moment, but then it picked back up, and the whisper was gone. I tried calling out, but only the rasp of my own voice answered me. I decided to keep moving anyway. The edge of the gorge offered a vantage point, and I wanted to see more than just the immediate clearing. I scrambled over rocks, the earth loose beneath my boots, and as I did, the light appeared again, closer, but not in the way any ordinary hiker would move. It paused, flickered, then continued in a slow, measured gait. It seemed to rise and fall, almost like it was breathing. My pulse raced. I kept expecting a branch to snap behind me, to see a person step out and wave, to prove that this was normal, but nothing happened. Only the light moved, and my shadow stretched thin against the canyon wall, tremoring in time with my heartbeat. I didn't see the lights up close until the evening settled into deep, starless black. By then, the lanterns, or whatever they were, had drawn a trail around my van, circling it, never still, never leaving. They were no longer above the ground or on any visible path. They were just there, hovering, walking as if something was inside them. I wanted to shut the van door and lock it, but curiosity kept my hands glued to the frame, my body straining to see. That's when I noticed the smell again, faint, almost like honey and smoke mixed together. It clung to the night air, seeping under the door, weaving around the tires. I gagged a little, my stomach turning. I wasn't alone in Black Pine Gorge, I realized then, but I wasn't sure if it was people or something else entirely. And the deeper realization wasn't just fear, it was doubt. My own mind felt unreliable. Had I seen the lights before? The spiral? The blog post? Or had I imagined it all as my nerves frayed against the canyon's edges? My instincts screamed at me to drive away, yet the VW sat there, calm, waiting. The engine's hum would have been a comfort, but I was frozen, watching, wondering how long I could trust my senses. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed inside the van, lanterns lit, trying to convince myself that I could outlast whatever it was circling me. The wind moaned through the pine needles, carrying with it the faint echo of the whisper from earlier. I swear I could hear faint footsteps on the roof, slow, deliberate, following my breathing. The metal of the van groaned under the weight of imagined pressure, and I thought, again, of that spiral, carved on a post I'd passed earlier, a symbol I didn't understand, but one that seemed to pulse when I focused on it. I couldn't stop thinking that the world outside the windows wasn't quite the one I remembered from the map, that the trails shifted if you weren't looking directly at them. By morning, the lights were gone. The sun rose pale, washing the canyon in colors that felt wrong, muted, like someone had drained the saturation overnight. My stomach hurt from the adrenaline, my hands cramped from gripping the steering wheel overnight. I wanted to tell myself it was over, that I had imagined it all. But then I noticed the small spiral scratched into the edge of my van door. I hadn't done it. I didn't know how it got there, and I smelled that faint honey smoke again, lingering, even as the breeze tried to carry it off. It was a reminder that Black Pine Gorge didn't end when the night did. It followed, patient, subtle, waiting for the next wanderer to see the lights that walked on two legs. I forced myself to drive, though every mile felt like a betrayal of the safety I'd imagined inside the van. The road curved and twisted differently than my memory told me it should. A ridge that had seemed distant yesterday now pressed against the horizon like a dark sentinel. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the ordinary, the crunch of tires over gravel, the faint smell of exhaust, but the canyon seemed to stretch and bend around me, shifting when I wasn't looking directly at it. That unnerving distortion made me glance constantly in the mirrors, half expecting the lights to be walking alongside the van, hovering just above the asphalt. I couldn't shake the feeling that wherever I went, they would follow, keeping pace with a patience I didn't understand. By late morning, I reached a narrow clearing along the river, framed by pine trees so dense that the sun's rays barely touched the ground. I stopped, thinking maybe I could rest, maybe let the nervous tension in my shoulders ease. That's when I heard it again, the whisper, low and precise, threading through the air like smoke. You shouldn't have come back. The voice didn't seem angry. It wasn't pleading. It was just stating a fact. I froze, staring at the forest floor. No movement but the occasional tremor of leaves in the wind. My heart slammed in my chest. I felt suddenly cold, though the morning sun should have warmed me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that someone else might be hiking or camping nearby, but my instincts weren't convinced. And then I saw them, or it, emerging from the shadows. Two small lights, no larger than lantern flames, moved upright. They were walking on something like legs, but not human. Their movement was jerky at first, unnatural, then fluid, deliberate. They circled the clearing, never stopping, never blinking. Each step seemed to echo against the canyon walls, a rhythm that lodged itself into my chest. I pressed my back against the van, gripping the keys so tightly the metal cut my palms, and told myself to breathe. Tell yourself it's nothing. Tell yourself it's just reflection, tricks of the morning light. But the smell hit me first. Burnt pine, candle wax, and that faint honey-like sweetness again. It wrapped around me, slow, thick, unrelenting. I gagged and stumbled backward, my instincts screaming that I should leave, but my curiosity rooted me in place. I tried to reach for the camera in my backpack, thinking maybe recording it would prove I wasn't losing my mind. But the moment I touched it, the lights stopped moving. It was impossible. They hung in the air, unmoving, almost expectant, like they were aware I had noticed. My breath caught in my throat. The wind went still. The world held its breath. I thought about all the erased posts, the vanished blog entries, the spirals carved into trail markers, and even the small scratch on my van. Patterns, maybe, warnings, maybe, or just coincidences. But right now it didn't matter. I was here, and whatever it was watching me. Then a figure appeared from the tree line. A man, or maybe something like a man. He was middle-aged, dressed in rough hiking clothes, and he didn't startle at the lights. He just stood there, staring at them with a calm I couldn't comprehend. He nodded slightly at me, and I felt my throat tighten. "You see it too," he said softly. "Most people don't. Most people wouldn't believe me if I told them." I wanted to ask what it was, wanted to demand he explain, but no words came. His eyes were steady, holding mine longer than seemed reasonable. Then he nodded again and retreated back into the trees, leaving me with the lights and the silence that had returned with the wind. I realized then that fear wasn't even the main problem. It was doubt. Doubt in my senses, in my mind, in everything I thought I knew about the world. The canyon seemed to twist, to stretch, to exist somewhere between reality and memory, and the lights, whatever they were, kept reminding me that I could trust nothing I saw or heard. I wanted to drive away to escape, but the trail behind me looked different than the one I had come from. The van's tires crunched against unfamiliar gravel, and I couldn't match the twists of the canyon to the map I'd printed. Even the spiral symbol, which I thought might be a guide, felt slightly off, angled differently than I remembered. As evening fell, the lights returned. Not just two, but more, smaller, dimmer, weaving through the shadows. They moved with a strange choreography, sometimes staggering, sometimes almost running, always following, never touching the ground. I kept the van lights on, hoping to push them back, but they didn't respond. They simply existed in the spaces the headlights couldn't reach, at the periphery, whispering at the edge of perception. I tried to sleep again, but it was impossible. Every sound, the sigh of the wind through the pines, the scrape of a branch, the low vibration in the canyon floor, set my nerves on edge. My eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see the lights reflected there, or worse, a human figure watching me from the shadows. And I kept smelling that same honey smoke scent, like it had been absorbed into the air itself, always present no matter where I moved. Sometime in the middle of the night, I think I saw one of the lights stop directly behind the van. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I just sat there, heart hammering, staring through the rear window. The light pulsed faint as if acknowledging me, and then it vanished. Not faded, not hidden, just gone. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones. The trail that had seemed impossible yesterday now looked different, almost familiar. The spiral I had followed, or thought I had followed, was carved into a tree at the edge of the clearing, fresh and sharp, like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I packed the van slowly, every sound making me jump. The lights didn't appear again, but the smell lingered, faint, almost playful. Before I left the clearing for good, I took one last glance back at the canyon. In the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement, a single lantern, stationary, watching me leave. And beneath it, carved into the rock, almost like a signature, was that spiral again. I wanted to believe it was coincidence. I wanted to believe I was imagining it. But the desert echoes, soft, patient, unrelenting, made it clear. They don't always point in the direction you expect. And even now, when I think about Black Pine Gorge, when I feel that faint honey smoke smell or see a spiral carved anywhere, I remember the lights walking on two legs, circling, waiting, patient. The canyon waits too, and somewhere deep down, I know it's not finished with me yet. By late afternoon, I realized I hadn't eaten. Not that it mattered. The nausea twisting my stomach wasn't hunger. It was the canyon itself, pressing, bending, whispering. Every turn in the trail now seemed unfamiliar. Rocks jutted where the map said they wouldn't. Trees blocked paths that had been clear. Even the river's bend, which I thought I knew, appeared wrong, as if I'd entered a place parallel to the one I remembered. My own memory had started betraying me. I told myself I'd just gotten lost. That was rational. That was what made sense. But rationality was evaporating fast. Then the lights appeared again. Dozens this time, not in any pattern I could discern, but moving upright, staggering like drunk travelers across the canyon floor. Some seemed impossibly far, yet close enough to feel heat from. Others hovered at eye level, glowing orange and golden. I tried to drive past them, hoping my van would act like a shield, but the road no longer followed any map or memory. It looped back on itself, the lights circling in tandem. And then I heard it. The whispering, layered this time. Many voices over one another, all saying, "You cannot leave, not yet." Panic clawed through me, and I slammed the van into reverse, the tires spinning over loose gravel. The lights scattered at first, then regrouped, flowing along the contours of the gorge like liquid fire. My pulse roared in my ears. Every nerve in my body screamed that I had to get out, had to escape. But every instinct to turn the wheel, to drive, to survive, felt meaningless. The canyon itself seemed alive, reshaping, mocking my sense of direction. That's when I noticed the spiral carved into a boulder near the road, a spiral that hadn't been there moments ago. Its edges glowed faintly, not with light, but with a sense of awareness, as if it was acknowledging my presence, marking me. I reached for the steering wheel with trembling hands, my breath loud in the van, trying to tell myself I was imagining it. And maybe I was. Maybe I had been imagining everything. The lights, the whispers, the smell that clung to my skin, sweet and burnt all at once. But when I felt the metal of the van shift under my fingers, I knew my senses weren't entirely failing. Something was here, watching, waiting, patient. The lights moved closer, circling the van, and I could swear they were staggering in rhythm with my heartbeat. I tried to start the engine, but the key turned with a hollow click. Nothing. The VW, my supposed sanctuary, betrayed me. And then a sound I can only describe as laughter, soft and human, but echoing like it came from every corner of the canyon at once. My hands flew to my ears, but it didn't stop. The wind carried it, twisting it, layering it over the whispering voices. I flung the door open and ran. The forest had changed entirely. The trail that had led here was gone, replaced by a thicket that clawed at my clothes, leaving scratches and blood. The air smelled stronger now, honey, smoke, something acrid I couldn't place. I stumbled, twisted my ankle on a hidden root, and fell hard into the dirt. The lights hovered above me, upright, circling, waiting. I realized then that they weren't moving randomly. They were moving in relation to me, aware of my fear, my hesitation, my every heartbeat. I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. A shadow moved closer, and for a moment I thought I saw a human form, the man from the clearing, standing just beyond the lights, calm, watching, almost smiling. Then the light pulsed around him and he was gone, leaving nothing but the echo of his nod in my mind. I crawled back toward the van, dragging myself through roots and brush, finally collapsing inside. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my body soaked in sweat and blood. The canyon outside was empty, or at least it appeared empty, but I knew better. I could feel it pressing against the metal, shifting the shadows, whispering. I didn't sleep. I didn't rest. I just waited for sunrise, knowing somehow that day wouldn't bring freedom. By morning, the lights were gone. The canyon looked ordinary, almost welcoming. The sun painted the pines in soft gold, and the wind hummed gently, carrying no whisper, no scent, no threat. I wanted to believe I had escaped, that the night had been some hallucination brought on by exhaustion and nerves. But the spiral was still there, etched into the inside of my van door now, glowing faintly in the sunlight. And that smell, the honey smoke faint teasing, lingered at the edges of my senses. I drove away slowly, never looking back. The road, thankfully, seemed normal now. The VW hummed along as if nothing had happened. And yet, every time I pass a canyon, every time I see a spiral carved into wood or stone or catch that faint honey smoke scent on the breeze, I remember Black Pine Gorge. I remember the lights walking upright, circling, patient. I remember the whispers, layered and soft. I remember the man who seemed to know more than he should, nodding as if acknowledging a shared secret. And I realize with a creeping, inevitable certainty that the desert echoes, but not always in the direction you expect. Some things follow, even when you think you've left them behind. And some nights when I close my eyes, I swear I can still see the lights walking toward me, step by slow step, counting my heartbeat, waiting for the moment I forget how to look away. I've learned that in the wilderness, silence isn't just silence. Sometimes it's the sound of something being erased. And on the night that truth finally caught up to me, the darkness felt like it was waiting for my name. My name is Caleb Rourke. I'm 37 years old, born and raised in the foothills of northern Arkansas, and I've spent most of my life drifting in and out of campgrounds across the United States in a beat-up Class C RV that's seen more miles than good decisions. I've always believed nature was honest. Harsh, maybe, unforgiving, sure, but honest. It's people who twist things, who hide their intentions, who lie. Out there among the trees, I told myself, at least you always know where you stand. But the longer you spend in these places, the more you begin to realize that nature doesn't have to lie. It just has to wait, and sometimes it waits for you. I didn't start out chasing disappearances. Nobody does. I wasn't an investigator or a journalist or one of those late-night forum addicts who pored over maps looking for patterns no one else could see. I was just a guy who loved camping alone, who felt most at peace with a fire crackling low, a mountain breeze shifting through the pines, and the comforting hum of my RV's fridge behind me. Life made sense when I was living out of a rolling box with everything I needed bolted to the floor. But then, one night in a quiet valley in the Rockies, a man walked out of the dark and made me question everything I had ever believed about being alone. It was early September, one of those nights where the air was cold enough to make the stars feel sharpened like you could cut your finger on the sky if you reached for it. I'd parked at a dispersed camping area just south of Rocky Mountain National Park. No hookups, no cell service, no ranger presence, just the kind of isolation you grow addicted to if you spend enough time in an RV. I'd settled in for the night with my lantern dimmed low and my map spread across my lap, deciding where I'd head next. That's when I heard footsteps outside, slow, dragging ones, the kind that don't belong to an animal. I froze immediately. Sound travels differently in the mountains, you learn that fast. Every noise has a fingerprint, and this one did not match anything I knew. Too heavy for a deer, too clumsy for an elk, too steady for a bear, and too close to be anything except human. I turned off the lantern, sat perfectly still. The only thing between me and whatever was out there was a thin aluminum door and the quiet, rising thump of my pulse. The footsteps stopped just beyond my passenger window. For a long moment, nothing happened. No voice, no breath, just presence, a weight in the air. Then a low voice said, "I used to camp here too." I didn't speak, didn't move. My lungs locked up in my chest like they didn't trust the air anymore. The man's silhouette shifted slightly, his shadow brushing across the thin curtain like a hand pressing down on fabric. "Do you know this place?" he asked. "Do you know what happened up here?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to demand who he was, why he was so close to my rig, why he was standing out there in the pitch black without a flashlight or a companion. But fear has a way of clamping your tongue down until your instincts have time to catch up. He spoke again. "People disappear here all the time." A coldness leaked down my spine, the kind that feels like someone tracing the base of your neck with an icicle. Then, without warning, he walked away. Not quickly, not threateningly, just casually, like he'd said all he needed to, like he hadn't just ambushed a stranger in the dark and passed along a warning that felt less like information and more like a burial notice. I heard his footsteps trail off into the forest, steady as before until they melted into the wind. I waited inside the RV for nearly an hour without moving, every muscle tight, every sound amplified. The cold creaked the walls. The pine branches outside scraped the metal siding. My breath fogged in front of me like smoke. Eventually, when I felt brave enough or stupid enough, I cracked open the door and shined a flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no dropped gear, no signs of anyone having walked there at all. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Because I've camped long enough to know that footprints always leave some trace. And people who wander alone at night tend to carry lights or gear or something. Whoever that man was, he walked like he didn't need a path. And that thought dug into me like a splinter. Over the next few weeks, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was a local. Maybe he knew the terrain well enough to move around without needing a flashlight. Maybe he came up to warn me because he'd noticed the surge of disappearances the area had been dealing with. But no matter how many explanations I forced out of myself, one thing kept returning. He never asked for help, never asked if I was okay, never introduced himself. He spoke like someone who wasn't worried about me. He was warning me. Like a man who'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see, like someone who had been here before. The more I thought about him, the worse the feeling grew. That sense of quiet unease turned into tension, tension into suspicion, suspicion into something heavier, an awareness that had nothing to do with him at all. Because once the idea of disappearances burrowed into my mind, I started noticing things. News reports I'd ignored, forum threads I'd scrolled past, flyers pinned to bulletin boards at gas stations and ranger stations, faded photos of hikers, backpackers, campers who'd left one day and never returned. 5 disappearances within a 50-mile radius of where I'd been parked. 3 within a single year. Every story the same. No sign of struggle, no remains, no tracks. Vanished. I've lived my life in places the map barely bothers to label. I've seen snow erase footprints in minutes. I've watched fog roll so thick it looks like the world forgot how to exist beyond 20 feet. I know how easy it is to get turned around and never find your way back. But I also know what doesn't happen. People don't disappear without a trace. Not in good weather. Not on established trails. Not with search teams, dogs, helicopters, drones. Not with days of effort. Not unless something wanted them gone. And once that idea took root, my fear grew teeth. I started to think about how the man had appeared at my campsite, how he'd known exactly where I was without me making a sound, how he didn't ask who I was. He just talked like he already knew the story he wanted to tell. But the worst part, the part that kept me awake, replaying him in my mind, was the way he talked about disappearances. not as something tragic, not as something mysterious, but as something expected, something inevitable, as if the wilderness wasn't a backdrop to the story, as if it was the thing writing it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to tell me I'd almost become part of it. For weeks after that night, I couldn't settle into a campsite without feeling watched, not in a paranoid, self-created way, but in the quiet, instinctive way animals sense a storm rolling in long before the clouds arrive. The wilderness felt different after that encounter. Bigger, hungrier, like it had been pretending to be harmless, and now that I'd seen a corner of its truth, it didn't care to pretend anymore. I told myself I needed answers, not just about the man, but about the disappearances themselves. Why so many hikers were vanishing from places that should have been safe. Why search parties always came back empty-handed. Why the forests I used to trust now felt like they were breathing in rhythm with me. So I pointed my RV toward Wyoming, then Montana, then back south toward Colorado, following a breadcrumb trail of missing person reports that stretched across national parks like a stitched wound no one wanted to acknowledge. I wasn't chasing ghosts. I was chasing patterns. But the deeper I went, the more those patterns started to look like a single shape. One I couldn't quite make out, but could feel pressing against me whenever I tried to sleep. The turning point came at Roosevelt National Forest. I'd parked at a primitive site off an old service road, the kind rangers never recommend, but everyone uses anyway because it feels like the last untamed place left. My spot was tucked between thick clusters of lodgepole pine, the canopy so dense that even at noon the light inside my RV stayed dim. The air smelled like sap and cold earth, clean, crisp, deceptively gentle. I was sitting outside near the fire ring, flipping through an old notebook where I kept details on every disappearance I'd logged. Names, dates, locations, ages, weather conditions, last known activities. A page full of people whose stories ended with a question mark. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't slow or dragging. They weren't careful. They were running. Fast. Straight toward me. My entire body locked. The sound was coming from the tree line behind my RV, heavy, frantic crunching through underbrush, snapping twigs, pounding against the forest floor with a kind of desperation that didn't belong to an animal. It was human. I stood up, half reaching for the hatchet I kept by the chair, my pulse hammering against my ribs so violently I could feel it in the base of my skull. The footsteps were close now, 15 yards, 10. Then they stopped, all at once, like someone had silenced them with a switch. I held my breath and listened, but there was nothing, no movement, no panting, no rustling, just the thick, unmoving stillness of the woods holding itself perfectly still. I called out, "Hello?" The word fell flat, dead, swallowed immediately by the trees. No answer. I backed toward my RV door, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark gap between the pines where the running had been coming from. Something was still there. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but that kind of sudden silence only happens when something is waiting. My fingers fumbled over the RV latch. Then a voice whispered from the dark. Not shouted, not spoken. Whispered, just loud enough to reach me. "Help me." My blood turned to ice. It was the voice of someone terrified, broken, breathless, trembling. Someone who sounded like they'd been running for their life. But there was something wrong with it. The voice wasn't coming from one place. It came from everywhere. It bled through the trees like wind shifting through dry branches, thin and strained and wavering. A voice stretched too far, like someone calling through cupped hands pointed the wrong direction. I swallowed hard. "Where are you?" A moment of stillness. Then, "Help me." The same words, the same tone, but identical, exactly identical. No change in cadence, breath, rhythm, like it wasn't a voice at all, like it was something repeating a sound it had heard once. I backed up the final step into the RV and slammed the door, locking it twice. My hands shook as I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out through the blinds. Nothing. Just trees. Just darkness. Just the feeling of something huge sitting behind the veil of night, studying the shape of my fear. The whisper came again, but this time it was right behind my RV. Help me. I stumbled backward until my knees hit the small dinette bench. My breath caught in my throat, shallow and fast. The RV felt suddenly too small, too fragile, like a tin can waiting to be crushed between someone's fingers. Every instinct screamed at me to drive. Leave the campsite, leave the forest, leave the entire state if I had to. But another instinct, deeper and darker, kept me frozen in place because something wasn't trying to lure me outside. Something was trying to sound human. And whatever had chased me across forests and valleys for months, whatever had followed the trail of disappearances long before I even knew I was tracing its outline, it was close enough now to speak through the walls. Eventually, the whispers stopped. The forest relaxed its breath. My RV settled into that soft, familiar groan of cooling metal. But I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't, because the voice I'd heard wasn't a stranger's voice. It was the exact voice of a missing hiker whose last recorded audio plea had been posted online months before. I'd listened to it 100 times trying to figure out what he'd seen in his final moments. And now, something out there was repeating it. Perfectly. I didn't stay until morning. I didn't wait for sunrise like any sane person would. I turned the key in the ignition, headlights cutting a thin white path through the trees, and I drove that RV down the service road faster than I should have dared. The whole time, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone or something running after me in the beam of my taillights, but the roads stayed empty, the forest stayed closed, and I didn't stop until the sky turned gray and the mountains began to shrink behind me. That was the night suspicion turned into dread. When I realized the disappearances weren't isolated incidents. They were pieces of something bigger, something that moved across states without being seen, something that learned, something that hid behind the voice of the last person it encountered, something that didn't just stalk the wilderness, something that was part of it. By the time I reached the next town, a quiet mountain community with one diner, one gas station, and a single blinking red light, I had already made my decision. I wasn't going home. I wasn't quitting. I wasn't going to pretend the forests were just forests anymore. I was going to keep digging, even if it meant stepping into the same darkness that had swallowed so many before me. Because whatever was out there, it knew me now. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for a reason. Not just to watch me, not just to scare me, but to decide whether the wilderness would claim another victim. I spent the next few days drifting from town to town in a kind of waking fog, physically awake, mentally drifting, like my mind was walking a few steps behind me trying to catch up. Every diner I stopped at had the same corkboard by the door, faded flyers, dog-eared photos, grainy printouts of missing hikers, campers, backpackers. Every board looked the same, and every board made my stomach twist a little tighter. But there was one flyer I kept coming back to. A boy named Ethan Ward, 12 years old, disappeared from a trail outside Yellowstone. His parents said he'd been just a few steps behind them. A bend in the path, a moment of looking away, and then he was gone. The search team scoured the area for weeks. Nothing, not even a shoelace. Ethan had been missing for nearly a year, and during my time digging into these cases, I'd heard his story more than any other. Locals talked about him with the quiet, haunted tone of people who'd been forced to accept an unacceptable truth. But it wasn't the story that held me. It was the boy's eyes. In the photo, Ethan wasn't smiling like most missing kids in those flyers. His expression was flat, maybe even a little wary, like he'd understood something his parents hadn't, something he couldn't say. I found myself staring at that picture in a little mountain town diner, my coffee going cold in front of me. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver hair tied back in a bandana, stopped beside my table and followed my gaze. "You thinking you might have seen him somewhere?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "No, just thinking about him." She sighed, her shoulders sinking. "Poor kid. Folks around here still won't talk about what they think happened. Some things just don't make sense." I hesitated. "What do they think happened?" She lowered her voice. "They think the forest took him. Any other time, I would have laughed it off. But after what I'd experienced, after the voice, after the footsteps, after the man in the Rockies, I didn't laugh. I didn't even blink. She caught the change in my expression. "You a camper?" "Full time," I answered. "Well," she said, tapping the edge of the flyer with a fingernail, "if you spend enough nights out there, you start hearing things, start seeing things. Most folks tell themselves it's the wind or animals or shadows, but sometimes the stories don't start in our heads. Sometimes they start out there." She nodded toward the window, toward the tree line behind the diner. I stayed quiet, but inside, something clicked, an understanding I didn't want but couldn't ignore. I wasn't chasing disappearances anymore. The disappearances were circling me. After leaving the diner, I headed toward a stretch of wilderness reported to be the last known area where Ethan had been seen. The trailhead was blocked off now, with a metal sign warning hikers about unstable terrain and dangerous conditions. But the locals told me the closure had nothing to do with safety. Too many people had gone missing there, and the forest had stopped giving back clues. By late afternoon, I had my RV parked on a flat pull-off near the old service road leading toward the closed trail. The air felt heavy, thicker, like humidity without moisture, like the atmosphere itself was hardening. The pines on either side leaned inward as if listening. As I stepped out, I felt something I hadn't felt since that night in the Rockies. Being watched. Not by a person. By a place. I followed the overgrown path past the warning sign, my boots sinking into ground that felt softer than normal, like walking across packed moss instead of dirt. The forest around me was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind felt muted, like the trees were choking off the sound. About half a mile in, the trail hit a sharp bend, and that's where I saw it. A single, tiny footprint, bare, small, fresh. I crouched down, staring at it in disbelief. The edges weren't weathered. There was no debris inside it. It couldn't have been there long. And if it belonged to Ethan, it made no sense. He'd been missing almost a year. A footprint like this shouldn't exist. But before I could think deeper, I heard rustling behind me. Light, careful, like someone stepping on leaves and trying not to. I turned slowly. At first, I didn't see anything. Then my eyes adjusted. And there, about 15 feet away, half hidden behind a tree trunk, was a figure. A small one. A child-sized one. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The figure shifted slightly, just enough for me to see one thing. Dark, wide eyes reflecting the faint light. Watching me unblinking. My throat tightened. "My name is Caleb. I'm here to help you. You don't have to be scared." The figure didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I could feel it in the base of my spine. When animals freeze, it's fear. When humans freeze, it's processing. But this wasn't either. This was stillness, perfect stillness, like something holding its shape and forgetting to act human. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Are you, Ethan?" The figure tilted its head at an unnatural angle, slow and deliberate, like it didn't understand the question, but wanted to. That was enough. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, to leave, to run. I took a careful step back. The figure mirrored the movement, not toward me, away, backing into the deeper forest, silent, graceful, wrong. "Wait," I called out, but there was no urgency in my voice anymore, just regret. Because some part of me knew I wasn't talking to a missing boy. I was talking to the reason he disappeared. The figure slipped behind a row of pines and vanished as if the forest swallowed it whole. Not a sound, not a snapped twig, just gone. The world around me suddenly felt colder. The air dampened as if a storm rolled through without wind. My skin prickled. Then a voice drifted through the trees, soft, thin, familiar. "Help me." The same voice from Roosevelt Forest, the same impossible imitation, but this time it whispered right beside my ear. I spun around, heart exploding in my chest, but nothing was there. Just trees, tall and silent, pretending they'd always been harmless. I stumbled backward, breath shaking, hands trembling. My mind scrambled through every story, every disappearance, every detail I'd collected. Kids. Adults. Experienced hikers, casual campers, people with gear, without gear, alone, in groups. The only common thread, they all vanished near places like this. Wide, quiet places where sound didn't behave right, where footprints didn't last, where trees felt too close and shadows felt too patient. Places where the wilderness wasn't just scenery, it was a participant. I backed away from the bend in the trail, keeping my eyes on the tree line where the figure had stood. Every step felt like a negotiation, a promise, a warning. By the time I reached my RV, the sun had dipped behind the ridgeline, turning the forest into a solid black wall of waiting. I climbed inside, locked the door, and sat there with my back against it, chest heaving. Not because I'd seen something impossible, but because I'd confirmed something I already knew deep down. These disappearances weren't random. They weren't accidents, and they weren't human. Something in the wilderness was watching. Something was learning. Something was choosing. And as I stared out through the windshield at the dark silhouette of the pines, I felt the unmistakable certainty that whatever had taken those people wasn't finished. Not even close. I didn't leave right away. I wish I could say I did, that I turned the ignition, floored the gas, and never looked back. But something held me there. Something like obligation, but heavier. Like a pull. A demand, the same thing that draws search teams back into the woods even after they know the odds. The same force that keeps grieving parents walking trails long after hope should have died. Whatever was out there had shown itself to me. It had mirrored me, spoken to me, followed me. And that meant something I wasn't ready to admit but could no longer deny. It had chosen me. Not as a victim, I would have felt that, but as something else. Maybe as a threat. Maybe as a witness, maybe as its next message to the world. I stayed awake long after sunset. My RV was parked in the only clearing along the service road where I could see enough sky to think. The forest rose around me on every side, tall and dark and unmoving like a circle of silent sentinels. Inside the RV, every light was off except for the dim glow from the stove clock. My breath steamed faintly in the air. Around 11 p.m., the sounds began. Not footsteps, not whispers, something worse. Breathing, soft, wet breaths right at the edge of the trees. Not labored, not animalistic, just steady, patient, like someone catching their breath after a long walk. I sat frozen at the small dinette table, every muscle tight. The breathing continued, steady, even, controlled, and it wasn't coming from one direction. It drifted, moved, circled. I could feel the shape of it more than hear it. I raised my eyes to the window. A shadow moved behind the glass. Slow. Deliberate. Wrong. I slid quietly off the bench and crouched low, pressing my back against the cabinet. The breathing grew louder, as if leaning closer to the side of the RV, as if trying to smell me through the thin aluminum. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something deeper. Recognition. The forest wasn't watching me anymore. It was examining me. I don't know how long I stayed like that, listening to the slow movement outside. Time stretched, bent, folded in on itself like the air had weight. Eventually the breathing stopped, but the silence left behind was worse, like the quiet after a scream you didn't hear. I waited another 30 minutes before I dared peek out. The trees were empty. The shadows were still. But inside me, something had changed. A line I didn't know existed had been crossed. It was no longer stalking me. It was letting me know it could enter my world whenever it wanted. I left the next morning just after dawn, driving until the mountains gave way to open plains and my pulse finally slowed. But even in the safety of distance, I couldn't shake the truth forming in the back of my mind like a bruise. Whatever was taking people, it wasn't killing them quickly. It was using them. Their voices, their shapes, their memories. I needed someone who had seen what I'd seen, someone who'd lost someone out there and didn't believe the easy explanations. That's what led me to Jenny Ward, Ethan's mother. She lived in a small rental house outside West Yellowstone. When she opened the door and saw me, a stranger, sunburned and exhausted, she almost closed it again. But when I said her son's name, she froze. "You're not one of those podcast people, are you?" she asked warily. "No," I said, "but I think I know something about what happened." Her eyes softened in a way that almost broke me. Grief is a strange thing. It makes people desperate for answers, but terrified of hope. She let me inside. Her living room was filled with photos. Ethan on a bike, Ethan holding a fishing pole, Ethan smiling in front of a campfire. None of those expressions matched the wary boy in the flyer. We sat on her couch. I told her everything. Not the supernatural parts, not at first. I told her about the patterns, the statistics, the clusters of disappearances around certain unmarked valleys or forgotten trails. She listened quietly, shoulders trembling, fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. But when I told her about the voice in Roosevelt Forest, she grabbed my wrist. "What did you hear?" she whispered. I hesitated. It sounded like someone trying to mimic a person, a voice I'd heard in a missing person recording. She swallowed hard. "Was it a child?" "Yes." She leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then her voice cracked. I heard it too. Her words hit me like a blow. She told me that a week after Ethan disappeared, she'd gone back to the trail alone, searching off path, screaming his name. The search teams told her not to, but grief doesn't follow protocol. She wandered too far and ended up near a fallen tree. That's where she heard it. Ethan's voice. Soft. Thin. Wrong. Calling for help. But when she ran toward it, the voice moved deeper into the trees. Never closer. Always just far enough to stay hidden. She followed it until she realized something horrible. The voice wasn't leading her toward Ethan. It was leading her away from safety. By the time she found her way back to the path, night had almost fallen, and she felt something watching her the whole walk back. She finished talking and collapsed into silent tears. I didn't have words. I didn't even have breath. Everything I'd feared, everything I'd suspected, validated in a single confession from a mother who'd heard the same imitation I had. I left her house an hour later, shaken to the core. But as I reached the RV door, she called out behind me, "If you find whatever did this," she paused, eyes raw, "don't bring it here. Don't bring it to my son." I understood what she meant. Don't lead it home. Don't let it follow you. Don't let it learn another voice. I promised her I wouldn't. But the moment I got into my RV, I knew it was too late. The woods had already marked me. That night, I parked at a lonely gravel turnout 20 miles outside town. I didn't want to stay near anyone. I didn't want whatever was attached to me to touch somebody else's world. The sky was clear, full of stars, sharp enough to hurt your eyes. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the tree line across the road, waiting for something to move. The air grew colder, heavier, still. And then a shape stepped out from the trees. Small, child-sized, bare feet, dark eyes. It didn't walk toward me. It just stood there, watching my RV, waiting. The longer I looked, the more wrong its shape became, like it wasn't designed to stand still that long, like it needed the trees behind it, like they were part of its structure, and stepping away from them took effort. Then it turned its head in a slow, unnatural motion and opened its mouth. No sound came out. But I saw the breath, not warm condensation, something darker, like the forest was breathing through it. I didn't get out. I didn't move. I didn't blink, because I understood something in that moment. The wilderness hadn't taken Ethan by accident. It had taken him because he'd seen something he wasn't meant to see, and now I was seeing it too. I don't know how long the figure watched me. Eventually, it stepped backward, one slow step at a time, until the darkness of the forest folded around it like a curtain closing. The moment it disappeared, the air lightened. Crickets resumed their chirping. The world exhaled. But I didn't. Because I finally understood the truth behind every headline, every case file, every unanswered question about the missing. They didn't vanish. They were claimed. And once something in the wilderness knows your name, it doesn't forget. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the empty patch of road where the figure had stood. My heart was still beating too fast, too hard. Every few minutes, I'd check the mirrors, half expecting to see something crossing the asphalt toward me. But nothing moved. When dawn finally pulled a pale line of light across the horizon, I felt more exposed, not safer. Because daylight wasn't strong enough to erase what I'd seen. It only revealed how close the forest really was, only 30 feet from the shoulder, dense and dark, like an open mouth waiting for the next breath. I drove, not to anywhere in particular, not with a plan, just forward, mile after mile, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my thoughts circling the same terrifying realization. The disappearances weren't about bad decisions or bad luck. They weren't wind, weather, predation, or panic. Something out there was choosing people, and it had chosen me. The fear didn't rise all at once. It grew gradually, like temperature creeping upward under a sealed door. Quiet unease in the morning, tension by noon, suspicion by afternoon as the road curved deeper into forested country, where the sky shrank and the trees leaned closer. I stopped for gas in a small Montana town around sunset. As I stood by the pump, letting the tank fill, a man in a dusty ranger uniform stepped out of the gas station convenience store. Middle-aged, weathered face, eyes tired the way only someone who searched for too many missing people becomes tired. He stared at me a few seconds too long. Then he approached. "You're not from around here, are you?" he said. "No," I answered. "Just passing through." He nodded toward my RV. "You're not heading into the Bitterroot Range tonight, are you?" I hesitated. I hadn't decided. He exhaled hard. "Don't. Roads get tricky, weather turns fast." His tone changed, quiet waited. "And people wander off sometimes." Something inside me tightened. I could have ignored him, could have brushed it off as local superstition, but his voice had the heavy cadence of a man who'd spoken those words too many times. "I know about the disappearances," I said softly. His eyes narrowed, as if assessing whether I was someone who could handle the truth or someone about to become another flyer on a bulletin board. Then, quietly, he asked, "Have you heard them yet?" My blood froze. "Heard? What?" He looked over his shoulder at the tree line before lowering his voice. "The calls." For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt charged, like we were sharing a confession. Then he straightened and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Take care of yourself out there," he said, turning away. "Not everything that sounds lost wants to be found." I watched him go, my mind spinning. I didn't believe in coincidences anymore, not after everything I'd seen. And now someone else, someone who lived on the edge of the wilderness, had confirmed the same impossible truth. People weren't hearing voices. The forest was using them. I drove until dusk deepened into full darkness and the mountains swallowed the last of the light. I pulled into a secluded turnout miles from the nearest house. If the thing was following me, I didn't want anyone else near it. I owed Jenny that much. I owed her son that much. Inside the RV, I sat on the bed with the lights off, listening, waiting. It didn't take long. Around midnight, the air changed. Pressure dropping, silence tightening. The same unnatural quiet I'd felt at Roosevelt Forest seeped through the walls of the RV. Then came the footsteps. Light at first. Barefoot, small, crunching gravel, approaching, slowly. I rose to my feet, my breath shallow, my chest tight. Every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet, but another instinct, something deeper, pushed me to stand my ground. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. A tiny shadow passed beneath the edge of the blinds. Then, a knock, soft, 3 times. I didn't move. Another knock, harder, like it was learning, adjusting. Then a familiar voice whispered right outside the door, barely muffled by the metal. "Help me." I closed my eyes. The voice wasn't Ethan's anymore. It wasn't the hiker's. It wasn't even the boy-shaped figures. It was mine, my own voice, speaking words I'd never said. "Help me." The air left my lungs in a single icy burst. That's when it hit me. This thing didn't just imitate voices. It learned them, remembered them, kept them, and now it was keeping mine. I backed away from the door inch by inch until the back of my legs hit the cabinets. The knock came again, 3 taps, perfectly spaced. I felt something trace across the outside wall of the RV, dragging lightly along the metal. Testing, searching for a weakness. Then the whisper came again, but this time from the back window. "Let me in." No breath, no tremble, just a perfect replica of my own voice, delivered with a calmness I didn't have. I didn't know whether to scream or run. Panic rose in my chest like a wave threatening to break. My knees buckled, my hands trembled. And that was when I realized something that pulled me out of my fear long enough to think, it wasn't trying to break in. It was trying to break me, trying to see how I'd react, trying to understand the boundaries of human fear, trying to learn. That realization steadied me in a strange, fractured way. Because if it needed to learn, it meant it wasn't omnipotent. It wasn't a god. It was a predator, intelligent, ancient, patient, but a predator still. And predators follow patterns. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly, deliberately. The thing outside went silent, as if listening, studying the change. Then, without warning, the RV rocked, a hard shove from the outside. The cupboards rattled, dishes clattered. I braced myself against the counter as another violent shove hit the side of the vehicle, followed by scraping sound that traveled the entire length of the RV like nails dragging along aluminum. It was circling again, not walking, dragging something heavy, something that sounded like a limb pulled through gravel. Then the whisper came from the roof. "Come out!" I shook with every step I took backward. My heel hit the fire extinguisher mounted near the door. My eyes snapped to it. One piece of metal, one object with weight, one thing that reminded me I was not entirely powerless. The next shove tilted the RV enough that I had to grab the counter to stay upright. My fear hit panic full force. I did something then I don't fully remember deciding. I threw open the small ceiling vent, reached up with the extinguisher, and slammed it against the metal grate. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. The creature outside went still. Not quiet, still. In a moment of pure instinct, I slammed the extinguisher again, harder this time. The metal rang out sharply. Silence. Then it withdrew. Not quickly, not frantically, calmly, slowly, as if realizing I wasn't as fragile as it expected, as if filing that new piece of information away for later. The breathing grew quieter. The scraping faded. The weight pressing against the RV walls lifted. Within a minute, the forest was silent again. But silence didn't mean safety. It meant the thing had learned enough for one night. I stayed awake until sunrise, shaking, exhausted but alive. When the first light hit the windshield, I turned the ignition and drove until the wilderness thinned and the land opened into wide, empty plains. I don't camp deep in the mountains anymore. I don't wander off alone, and I don't ignore missing person posters. Because I know now, truly know, that the wilderness is not empty. It sees us. It listens. It remembers. And sometimes it decides who will not return. I'm still Caleb Rourke, 37, full-time RVer, a man who's seen something he can't explain and can't forget, a man who travels not to escape the wilderness, but to stay ahead of its shadow. Maybe one day it'll catch up. Maybe one day I'll hear my own voice calling to someone else from the trees. But until then, I keep moving, because unsolved disappearances don't stay unsolved. Not forever. Sooner or later, the wilderness claims another victim, and I refuse to be next.